Somewhere beneath the jagged spine of the Canadian Rockies, carved into limestone that geologists insist should be solid and unbroken, there are tunnels, not small passages worn by underground rivers, not shallow caves carved by centuries of erosion, tunnels, wide enough for two men to walk side by side. Passages that run for distances no natural process has ever satisfactorily explained. Corridors that change direction at precise angles, that rise and fall in patterns that feel deliberate, that end in chambers with walls so smooth they look finished. Historians have been quietly arguing about these tunnels since the late 1800s. Some have dismissed them entirely. Some have devoted careers to trying to explain them away. And a small, persistent group has spent decades asking the question nobody in official academia wants to answer. Who made them, and when? If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know, where are you right now, and what time is it? Because here is the thing that makes this particular mystery different from the usual parade of fringe theories and wishful thinking. The evidence is real. The tunnels exist. Geologists have been inside them. Surveyors have mapped sections of them. Indigenous oral traditions have described them for longer than Canada has been a country. The controversy is not about whether the tunnels are there. The controversy is about what they mean, who put them there, and why the official history of this continent has spent over a century trying not to talk about them. The Canadian Rockies stretch for roughly 1,500 kilometers along the border between Alberta and British Columbia. They are some of the most dramatic terrain on the North American continent. Peaks that top 3,000 meters. Glaciers that have been grinding through stone for 10,000 years. River valleys carved so deep, they feel like wounds in the earth. This is a landscape that has been studied, surveyed, mapped, and photographed from every possible angle. Geological surveys, going back to the 1870s. Topographical work by the Canadian Pacific Railway as it pushed west through the mountains in the 1880s. Decades of academic geology, mining exploration, provincial park management. These mountains are not unknown territory. And yet, beneath them, something has been quietly waiting for an explanation that never fully arrives. Before we go further, you need to understand something about how geology works in the Rockies. These mountains are primarily limestone and dolomite, carbonate rock. The kind of stone that does form natural cave systems over millions of years, as slightly acidic groundwater dissolves the rock along fracture lines and bedding planes. The Canadian Rockies have legitimate, natural cave systems. Castleguard Cave in Banff National Park is one of the longest caves in Canada. Nobody disputes that natural caves exist here, but natural caves look a certain way. They have irregular walls, textured by dissolution. They branch in unpredictable directions as water found the path of least resistance. They narrow and widen unpredictably. They tend to follow the angle of the rock strata, tilting and dipping with the bedding planes. Their floors are uneven, covered in speleothems and sediment. They feel like what they are, products of random geological process. What has been described in the tunnel reports is different. The walls are too regular. The cross-sections are too consistent. The changes in direction happen at angles that don't correspond to natural fracture patterns in the rock. And the floors, in multiple independent accounts, show signs of being level. Not water-carved level. Deliberately level. The kind of level that requires intention. That is the thing that keeps this story alive. Not one account, not one eccentric prospector with an overactive imagination, but decades of independent reports. From geologists, from surveyors, from railway workers, from indigenous guides, all describing something that doesn't fit the template of natural formation. Something that was made. Let's start at the beginning. Not the beginning of the tunnels themselves, which is a question we will spend a long time trying to answer, but the beginning of the documented record. The first written accounts of unusual underground passages in the Canadian Rockies that made it into any kind of formal record date to the early 1880s. The timing is not a coincidence. The first reports, the Canadian Pacific Railway was the most ambitious engineering project in North American history at the time it was being built. Stretching nearly 7,000 kilometers from Montreal to Vancouver, It required pushing a rail line through terrain that had never seen a road, let alone a train track. When the construction crews hit the Rocky Mountains in the early 1880s, they faced challenges that broke men and equipment and budgets. They were blasting through stone, filling ravines, carving tunnels, and trying to find routes through passes that explorers had only barely mapped. It was this work, the surveying and the blasting, and the desperate searching for viable routes through the mountains, that first put large numbers of European workers into geological contact with the deep interior of the Rockies. And some of what they found was not in the geological surveys. The earliest formal reference appears in a letter written in 1883 by a railway survey engineer named Thomas Holt, working for the Canadian Pacific Railway's advanced survey teams. The letter was addressed to his supervisor in Montreal and has since been preserved, though only partially, in the CPR's historical archive. Holt described, in careful and notably cautious language, what his team had encountered while surveying a potential route through a valley in what is now the southern portion of Banff National Park. His crew had been following a natural drainage feature along a limestone cliff face when one of his indigenous guides, a stony Nakota man named in the records only as Antoine, pointed out an opening in the cliff that the crew had initially dismissed as a shallow overhang. Antoine, according to Holt, was reluctant to approach it. He used a word that Holt's translator rendered into English as something like the old road, though Holt noted that the translation felt imprecise and that the indigenous term seemed to carry more weight than that phrase suggested. When Holt and two of his men went inside with lanterns, what they found made it into his letter, but apparently not into his official survey report. The passage ran inward from the cliff face, and rather than narrowing or dropping as natural caves in that limestone formation typically did, it maintained a consistent width of approximately 12 feet across and roughly 8 feet high for as far as their lanterns could throw light, which Holt estimated at perhaps 200 feet before they turned back. The walls were not rough. He wrote specifically that the walls were surprisingly uniform in their texture, almost as if the passage had been shaped rather than dissolved. The floor was flat. He noted that explicitly. Not pebble-strewn, not irregular with speleothem growth, but flat, in a way that he found he could not attribute to natural water action. Holt and his men went back to their survey work, and the railway was eventually built through a different pass. His letter sat in the archive and was not cross-referenced with any geological study until a researcher named Walter Chadwick came across it in 1971 while doing unrelated research on CPR construction history. Chadwick recognized what Holt had been describing and started looking for other references. What he found was the beginning of a paper trail that, once you start following it, does not lead to comfortable conclusions. Because Holt was not the first. He was just the first whose account made it into a corporate archive in a form that survived. Before him, the indigenous peoples of the region had been describing the same tunnels for as long as oral tradition ran, and their descriptions were not the cautious, hedged language of a 19th century railway engineer trying not to sound foolish in a professional letter. Their descriptions were detailed, consistent, and carried the weight of knowledge passed down through generations. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's stay with the documented European encounters for a while, because the paper trail from the 1880s forward is important on its own terms before we layer the indigenous knowledge over it. The railway brought more than surveyors into the mountains. It brought geologists working for the Canadian government's Geological Survey, which had been conducting formal scientific documentation of Canadian rock formations since 1842. And among those government geologists, at least two filed reports in the 1880s that mentioned anomalous passage formations in the limestone of the Rockies. The first was George Mercer Dawson, one of the most respected Canadian geologists of his era, a man whose name now appears on maps all over British Columbia and the Yukon. Dawson worked extensively in the Rockies during the 1880s, and his field notebooks, preserved at the Geological Survey of Canada, contain a passage from 1886 that has been noted by researchers who have gone looking for it. Dawson described entering a cave system near the Kicking Horse Pass area and finding, deeper in than the natural formations extended, what he called a worked passage. His language was deliberate. He was a trained geologist. He knew what natural dissolution looked like. He wrote that the passage walls showed none of the typical dissolution morphology he would expect, and that the cross-section was unnervingly consistent over a distance he estimated at over 300 feet. He noted tool marks, not scratches from natural abrasion. Marks that were parallel, evenly spaced, and ran horizontally across the walls in a pattern consistent with deliberate shaping of the stone. He wrote the words tool marks with a question mark beside them, as if he was uncertain whether to commit to the observation. But he wrote them. Dawson did not publish this finding. His official reports from that survey period contain no mention of the worked passage. His field notebook notation is the only record. Researchers who have asked the Geological Survey of Canada about this specific entry have been told the notebooks are part of the historical archive and accessible to researchers by appointment, which is true, but the specific notebook pages have reportedly been unavailable on several occasions due to ongoing cataloguing work. For a significant period of time, spanning multiple decades. That is the kind of detail that makes historians nervous, not because it proves anything on its own, but because it is not the only time records relating to these tunnels have been difficult to access. What the Blackfoot and Cree actually said, 30 years before Thomas Holt wrote his letter, 40 years before George Dawson made his notebook entry, the indigenous peoples of the eastern slopes of the Canadian Rockies had been telling stories about the underground passages for as long as their oral traditions ran. But the stories they told were not the vague, poetic kind that outsiders often dismiss as myth. They were specific. They described routes. They named locations. They specified what you would find inside and what you should not do when you found it. The Blackfoot Confederacy, which at various points in history controlled an enormous territory stretching from the North Saskatchewan River south into what is now Montana, has a category of places in their traditional geography that translates roughly as the places beneath. This is not a metaphor for the underworld in a spiritual sense, though there are spiritual dimensions to it. It refers to specific, physical locations where the earth opens into passages that go deep and far. These places appear in Blackfoot oral tradition not as mythological settings, but as functional landmarks. Places you use for navigation, places you avoid during certain seasons. Places that have specific protocols attached to them, rules about who may enter, when, and for what purpose. James Kipling, a Methodist missionary who worked among Blackfoot communities in the 1870s, wrote an account of a conversation with an elder named Bull Plume who described the passages with a specificity that Kipling found both fascinating and unsettling. Bull Plume told him, through an interpreter, that the passages beneath the mountains were very old, not made by any people alive today, not made by the people who came before the people alive today, made before the time of the Great Cold, which, when Kipling pressed for clarification, the interpreter said meant the time when the ice covered everything. Bull Plume described them as having walls you could see your face in if you held a torch close enough. He described them as going beneath the mountains, from one side to the other, and he said something that Kipling recorded verbatim because it struck him as so unusual. He said that the passages did not belong to the mountain, that the mountain had simply grown around them, that the passages were older than the mountains themselves. Now, Kipling was a 19th century missionary, with all the assumptions and limitations that implies. He recorded this primarily as an example of what he considered interesting, indigenous cosmological thinking, not as a geological data point. But when you read that account, alongside what researchers now know about the geological history of the Canadian Rockies, the phrase, "the passages are older than the mountains," becomes considerably more interesting, because the Rocky Mountains, as they currently exist, are relatively young in geological terms. The major uplift that created the modern mountain range happened during the Laramide orogeny, roughly 70 to 50 million years ago. But the limestone that forms most of the range is much older. Some of it dates to the Devonian period, 350 to 400 million years ago, and the same limestone that forms the mountains also extends beneath them, into older, deeper geological formations. If there were passages in the limestone that predate the mountain building event, they would technically be older than the mountains in their current form. That is not a mystical claim. That is a geological possibility. Whether Bullplume understood the geological mechanism behind what he was describing is a different question. But the statement itself is not as strange as Kipling apparently thought it was. The Cree oral tradition takes a somewhat different approach to the same subject. Where the Blackfoot tend to speak of the passages as functional landmarks in a living landscape, the Cree stories frame them more explicitly in terms of what happened there, who used them, what was left behind. The Cree nations, whose territory bordered the eastern foothills of the Rockies, have stories about a time before the current age of the world, when a people who are described variously as the Old Ones, the first makers, or in some accounts, simply as the ones who came from far off, lived in the mountains and built roads through them. These roads were underground. They connected places that would otherwise require days of travel across difficult terrain. They were used for trade, for movement during winter when the mountain passes were impassable, and for purposes that the Cree stories describe as ceremonial in nature, involving rituals associated with the movement of important objects or people between communities. The Old Ones who built these roads are not described as supernatural beings. They are described as human beings, people with hands and tools and purposes. People who eventually left, or in some versions of the story, who went deeper in and did not come back out. A Cree elder named Samuel Rabbit Nose, interviewed in 1923 by ethnographer Alanson Skinner for the American Museum of Natural History, gave a detailed account of what he called the stone paths beneath the mountains. Skinner's notes from this interview, which are in the museum's archive, record that Rabbit Nose described the entrances to the passages as deliberately hidden, that they were located in specific geological formations that he could not name in English but described by shape, and that the interiors of the passages contained markings on the walls that were not natural and were not made by any known indigenous group of his acquaintance. He described the markings as older than old, using a linguistic construction that his interpreter said indicated something from before the current world cycle. He described them as being arranged in rows and columns, in patterns that repeated, and as covering walls over distances that he estimated in terms of walking time, suggesting passages that ran for what would translate to several kilometers at minimum. Skinner published a version of this in his subsequent ethnographic work, but reduced it to a brief mention of indigenous cave lore, stripping out the specifics. His original handwritten notes, however, are considerably more detailed. And when a researcher named Patricia Gould went through the AMNH archive in the 1990s, working on a project about indigenous geographical knowledge in the Canadian West, she found Skinner's full notes and recognized that what Rabbit Nose had described was consistent with accounts coming from an entirely different source. The Geological Survey reports, the railway engineers, the prospectors whose stories she had been collecting from regional archives in Alberta, the convergence between indigenous oral tradition and European documentary evidence is one of the most important things to understand about this mystery. It is not a case of indigenous stories confirming something that Europeans discovered. The indigenous knowledge was there first, by centuries. What the European accounts do is provide a body of corroborating physical description from people who had no knowledge of the oral traditions, describing the same features, the same locations, the same anomalous characteristics. And then there is a third thread, one that comes from neither indigenous tradition nor European survey work, but from a strange, half-documented chapter in the history of Canadian amateur archaeology that most historians would prefer to forget entirely. In the 1890s and early 1900s, as the Canadian West was being rapidly settled and developed, there was a wave of what we might generously call enthusiastic amateur exploration happening in the foothills and lower mountain ranges. Some of these men were legitimate scientists, some were treasure hunters, some were simply curious settlers who had heard stories from indigenous neighbours and wanted to see for themselves, and some of them wrote down what they found. The reports that came out of this period are inconsistent in quality, biased by the assumptions of their era, and impossible to fully verify. but they are also remarkably consistent in certain specific details. Details that the authors could not have coordinated, because many of them were writing independently and in some cases were clearly unaware of other accounts. They describe the same cross-sectional dimensions, roughly 10 to 14 feet wide and 7 to 9 feet high. They describe the same floor character, flat, cleared of loose material. They describe the same wall texture, smooth relative to the surrounding natural limestone. And they describe the same feature that stops everyone cold when they encounter it, the marks. The marks on the walls of these passages are the single most contested element of the entire tunnel mystery, because marks that look like they were deliberately made, arranged in regular patterns, covering large sections of wall, cannot be explained away as natural formation. They have to mean either that someone made them, or that there is some geological process creating regular patterns on these particular walls that has not been documented in any comparable limestone formation anywhere else. Neither explanation is comfortable for mainstream archaeology. The geologists who disappeared. Between 1890 and 1940, at least 4 separate professional geological expeditions went into the limestone cave systems of the Canadian Rockies, specifically to investigate reports of anomalous tunnel formations. 3 of them produced no public results. 1 produced results that were published and then became very difficult to find. The first expedition we have documentation for was organized in 1891 by the Geological Survey of Canada in response to accumulating reports from railway and mining operations in the mountains. The survey dispatched a 2-man team, geologist Arthur Whitmore and his assistant James Farrell, to investigate several specific locations in the Bow River Valley where anomalous formations had been reported. They went in with proper equipment, notebooks, measuring instruments, sketch tools, a photographic apparatus. They were gone for 17 days in the field. When they returned to Ottawa, they submitted a report that was logged as received by the survey's archives and assigned a document number. That document number still exists in the catalogue. The document itself does not. The catalogue entry describes the subject as Limestone Formation Anomalies, Bow Valley Survey. The document is listed as archived. When researchers have requested it, they have been told it is not locatable in the physical archive. Now, documents do get lost. Archives are imperfect. This could be a mundane clerical story, except that Whitmore's personal papers, held by his family and eventually donated to the University of Toronto Library in the 1960s, contain a letter he wrote to his wife from the field during that expedition. In the letter, he describes finding something that he says he cannot explain in any geological framework he knows. He writes that the passage they entered on the 3rd day of fieldwork was clearly not a natural formation, that it showed evidence of deliberate construction, and that whoever had made it had done so with tools and intentions he could not account for. He wrote that he was not sure what to say in his formal report. He wrote, and this is the phrase that researchers have been quoting ever since, that he had found something that either required a complete rethinking of what happened on this continent before European contact, or required a simpler explanation that he had not yet arrived at. He never seems to have arrived at the simpler explanation, and his formal report disappeared into the archive. James Farrell's subsequent career is also interesting. He left geological survey work entirely within 18 months of this expedition and became a school teacher in rural Ontario. He gave an interview to a local newspaper in 1908 when he was in his 40s. In the context of a human interest piece about former explorers, in which he was asked about the most memorable thing he had seen in his years of fieldwork. He said he had seen things in the Rockies that he thought about every day but had no way to explain. When the interviewer pressed him, he said only that the mountains were older than people thought and that what was beneath them was older still. And then he changed the subject and the reporter moved on. The second expedition that produced interesting gaps in the record was organised privately, not by the government, but by a group of investors connected to mining speculation in the Rockies in 1903. They hired 2 geologists from McGill University to do a preliminary survey of potentially promising limestone formations in the area around what is now Kootenay National Park. The McGill professors, whose names appear in the university's faculty records for that period, filed a report with their investors that was never made public. One of them, in a letter preserved in the McGill archive among his personal correspondence, wrote to a colleague at another university, describing in general terms what the survey had found. He described passage systems that were anomalous and that showed, in his phrasing, evidence of anthropogenic modification, meaning modification by human beings, at a scale and in a geological context that could not be accounted for by any known historical occupation of the region. He wrote that he and his colleague had agreed not to discuss the findings publicly until they had a theoretical framework that could accommodate them. No such framework was ever published by either man. The third expedition, in 1921, was organized by an independent researcher named Gerald Forsyth, who had spent 15 years collecting documentary evidence about the tunnel reports and had finally raised enough private funding to mount a proper investigation. Forsyth is a figure who appears in the margins of several Canadian scientific histories of that period, described variously as an enthusiastic amateur, a self-taught researcher, and occasionally in terms that were clearly meant to dismiss him. He was not a credentialed geologist. He was a schoolteacher turned independent scholar who had read everything he could find on the subject and had spent considerable time in conversation with Indigenous elders in Alberta communities whose oral traditions overlapped with the tunnel stories. Forsyth went into the Rockies in the summer of 1921 with a team of 4 men, including one Stony Nakoda guide whose name in the records appears as Joe Running Bear. They were in the field for 23 days. When they came back, Forsyth had notebooks, measurements, sketches, and photographs. He spent the following 2 years writing up his findings, which he submitted in manuscript form to several Canadian scientific publications and to McGill University Press. Every submission was rejected. The rejection letters, some of which survive in correspondence collected by a researcher who wrote a biographical piece on Forsyth in the 1980s, are interesting. They do not say his claims are false. They say his evidence is insufficient to support his conclusions. They say his methods do not meet scientific standards. Several say, in language that feels defensive in retrospect, that the passage formations he describes have entirely natural explanations that he has failed to consider. Forsyth self-published his findings in 1924 under the title Beneath the Rockies, a survey of anomalous passage formations and their implications for pre-Columbian North American history. It was printed in a run of 300 copies. Fewer than 40 copies are known to still exist today. The book describes in careful detail the passages Forsyth's team mapped, the measurements they took, the photographs they made, and the wall markings they documented. It also contains a lengthy section drawing on the Indigenous oral traditions Forsyth had spent years collecting. It is a careful, methodical piece of work by a man who knew his credibility was on the line and was trying very hard not to overstate his case. The book was reviewed in exactly one scientific publication, a small geological journal based in Montreal, and the review was dismissive to the point of contempt. Forsyth died in 1939. His original notebooks and photographic plates were donated to the University of Alberta after his death. They arrived, they were catalogued, and then, sometime in the 1950s, they were apparently misfiled or lost during a reorganization of the archive. The catalogue entries still exist, the materials do not. The fourth expedition, the one that actually produced a published result before that result became difficult to find, happened in 1937. A team from the University of British Columbia Geology Department, led by Professor Charles Elmore, conducted a survey of cave systems in the southern Rocky Mountain Trench area, specifically to investigate reports that had been circulating in geological circles for decades. Elmore was a mainstream scientist, careful and conservative, and his stated purpose was to provide a definitive geological explanation for the anomalous formations that kept appearing in field reports. He had access to previous reports, including Forsyth's self-published book, and his intention, reading between the lines of his preliminary correspondence, was essentially to debunk. What he published instead, in a paper in the Canadian Journal of Geology in 1938, was something considerably more equivocal. The paper, which is cited in a handful of subsequent geological papers, but which has been out of print and difficult to access for decades, described in careful technical language the passage formations his team had investigated and concluded that they could not be adequately explained as natural dissolution features given several specific characteristics. He listed the consistent cross-sectional dimensions. He described the horizontal wall markings in a section he clearly found uncomfortable to write, calling them an anomalous surface feature of uncertain origin. He described the floor preparation, using the word preparation rather than formation, which is a distinction that in geological writing carries significant weight, and he concluded, in the final paragraph of his paper, that the most parsimonious explanation for the observed features was anthropogenic modification of pre-existing natural passages at an undetermined historical period. That is the careful, hedged language of a scientist trying not to say something he knows will be career-defining in all the wrong ways. But what he is saying, stripped of the hedges, is that someone made these things, and he has no idea when or who. The paper caused what contemporary observers described as a quiet uproar in Canadian geological circles. Elmore received letters from colleagues, some supportive, most not. He published one response to his critics, defending his methodology and his conclusions, and then he moved on to other research areas and never wrote about the tunnels again. The original paper exists. Copies of it are held in several university libraries, but it does not appear in the standard reference databases that geological researchers use, which means anyone who doesn't already know it exists is unlikely to find it by accident. It is there if you look for it specifically. But the path to finding it specifically requires already knowing that it's worth looking for. Which brings us to the question that sits underneath all of this accumulating evidence. Not just what the tunnels are, but why, for over 100 years, official institutions, government surveys, academic publications, and archival systems have shown such a consistent pattern of losing, burying, dismissing, and avoiding engagement with what the evidence actually suggests. The survey of 1,887 and the sealed report, to understand why official institutions behave the way they do around this subject, you have to understand the historical and political context of what was at stake in the late 19th century, when the first serious documentation of the tunnels was beginning. Canada became a country in 1867. The Dominion of Canada was a new nation, freshly confederated, deeply anxious about its legitimacy and its future, and engaged in a political and economic project that depended on a specific version of history. The version of history that the new country needed was one in which the land west of Ontario was essentially empty, unimproved, unused, terra nullius, land that belonged to no one until Europeans arrived to claim it. This was not a casual assumption, it was a legal and political necessity. The treaties being negotiated, or in many cases imposed, on Indigenous peoples across the West during this period were built on the foundational claim that prior occupancy by Indigenous peoples did not constitute the kind of established civilization that would give them legal title to the land, under European or Canadian law. Into this political environment, the idea that the Canadian Rockies contained evidence of ancient, sophisticated, pre-Columbian construction was not merely scientifically inconvenient, it was politically catastrophic, because if there had been people building permanent, engineered infrastructure in these mountains before the Ice Age, or at the very least thousands of years before European contact, then the foundational premise of the entire colonial project in Western Canada began to look considerably more complicated. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is basic political history. Governments suppress evidence that undermines their foundational legal claims. It happens in every country that was built on conquest. The specific form it takes varies, but the underlying mechanism is the same. You do not need a secret cabal meeting in a dark room. You need only an institutional culture in which scientists who work for government agencies understand, without being told explicitly, that certain findings are not welcome. And in the Canadian case of the 1880s and 1890s, the institutional culture was doing exactly this work. George Mercer Dawson, the geologist who wrote about the worked passage in his notebook, but not in his official report, knew perfectly well what his employers at the Geological Survey of Canada needed from him. He knew that the purpose of his work was to support the development and exploitation of the Canadian West, not to complicate its legal and political foundations. He was not an evil man. He was a careful, ambitious scientist operating in an institutional context that had very clear ideas about what useful results looked like. This context explains what happened in 1887, 3 years before Whitmore and Farrell's expedition, when the Geological Survey organized what was, in terms of its scope and its apparent ambition, the most serious early attempt to document and explain the tunnel formations. This expedition is not the one we lack records of. It is the one where the records exist, but where a specific portion of them has been officially sealed. The 1887 survey was led by Robert Bell, who was one of the most accomplished field geologists in Canadian history, a man who had mapped enormous sections of northern Canada and whose work is still cited in geological literature. Bell went into the Rockies in the summer of 1887 with a substantial team, well-funded and properly equipped, as part of a broader geological survey of the mountain regions. Among the areas he was specifically tasked to investigate were several locations in the southern Rockies where mining and railway interests had reported unusual underground formations. Bell's official published reports from this survey are available. They cover extensive geological data, rock formations, mineral deposits, hydrological features. They are thorough and professional. They do not mention the tunnel formations at all. But in 1887, the Geological Survey of Canada was also keeping what were called supplementary field reports, more detailed internal documents that were not intended for public publication. These supplementary reports were archived separately from the official published records. The supplementary report from Bell's 1887 Rocky Mountain Survey exists. Its existence is documented in the archive catalogue of the Geological Survey of Canada, which is held at the National Archives of Canada. The catalogue entry describes it as containing observations on anomalous limestone features, a Southern Rocky Mountain Survey. 1887. The document is listed in the catalogue as a sealed record, access restricted. The reason given for the restriction in the catalogue notation is the standard language used for sensitive government documents. The stated rationale is national security considerations, legacy classification, national security considerations. For an 1887 Geological Survey report about rock formations in the Rockies, researchers who have requested access to this document through the Access to Information Act have been told that the document falls under an exemption for records that could be injurious to the conduct of federal-provincial relations, or to the protection of the Crown's interests in relation to land claims. That is the official language. What it means, translated out of bureaucratic terminology, is that the document contains something that the Canadian government considers relevant to land claims cases and therefore potentially dangerous to the government's legal position in those cases. The land claims exemption for a geological survey document about rock formations in the mountains from 1887. The only way that makes sense is if the geological survey document contains evidence of pre-Columbian human activity in those mountains at a scale and sophistication that would be relevant to the legal question of prior occupancy, which is precisely what the researchers who have been investigating this subject for decades believe it contains. Patricia Gould, who we mentioned earlier as the researcher who found Alanson Skinner's full field notes at the American Museum of Natural History, spent a significant portion of her career trying to access the Bell report. She was unsuccessful. In a paper she published in a Journal of Canadian Studies in 2001, She documented her attempts to access the document and the responses she received, and she noted the profound irony that a document whose existence is officially acknowledged and whose subject is geological observation is being withheld on grounds that connect it to active land claims cases. She wrote that in her professional judgment, the only explanation for this classification that made sense was that the document contained direct physical evidence of pre-Columbian construction in the Canadian Rockies that the government did not want introduced into legal proceedings where Indigenous peoples were arguing for territorial rights based on historic occupation. She was, to put it mildly, not welcomed with open arms in mainstream Canadian academic circles after that paper was published. But the pattern she identified is real and it is documented. And it connects the tunnel question not just to scientific mystery, but to the longest and most contentious political conflict in Canadian history. The question of who was here first, and what that means for who has the right to be here now. The tunnels are not just a geological curiosity. They are potential evidence in a legal and moral argument that has been running for over 150 years. And that is why they keep disappearing from archives. Inside the tunnels. Now, let's talk about what people actually describe when they have been inside these passages. Because the documentary record, frustrating and gapped as it is, does include enough detailed first-person accounts that a fairly consistent picture can be assembled. Not a complete picture, not a definitive picture, but consistent enough across enough independent sources that we can say, with reasonable confidence, that certain features appear in these passages and that those features are anomalous. Let's start with dimensions. The most commonly cited figure for the width of the main passages is between 10 and 14 feet, approximately 3 to 4 meters. The most commonly cited height is between 7 and 9 feet, roughly 2 to 2.5 meters. These are not wild, dramatic dimensions. They are the dimensions of a functional corridor, not a grand cathedral passage, not a cramped tunnel you have to crawl through. A corridor, wide enough for several people to walk abreast, high enough to walk upright without concern, consistent enough across hundreds of feet of documented passage to suggest that whoever created this dimension held it as a design standard. The consistency of the cross-section is one of the features that most clearly argues against natural formation. Natural cave dissolution is governed by the path of water through fractured rock. Water does not maintain consistent geometry over long distances. It widens where fractures are larger. It narrows where the rock is denser. It changes height as it follows bedding planes. The passages described in the tunnel accounts maintain their dimensions, with a regularity that simply does not occur in natural cave systems. The floors. Every account that mentions the floor mentions that it is level, not smooth, in the sense of being polished or finished, but level in the sense of having been cleared of the debris and speleothem growth that covers natural cave floors, and in some accounts, in the sense of showing evidence of having been deliberately worked to create a flat walking surface. Forsyth's 1924 book includes careful, measured sketches of cross-sections of the passages he surveyed, and these sketches show a consistent floor that sits below the line of the natural bedrock, suggesting that material was removed rather than deposited to create it. The walls. The wall surface in the main passages is described consistently as being smoother than the surrounding natural limestone formations, but not polished. Not finished in the way that, say, the walls of an Egyptian tomb are finished. More like a surface that has been worked to remove the roughest projections and irregularities, leaving a surface that reads as shaped rather than dissolved. In some accounts, particularly the older ones, from the 1890s and early 1900s, the wall surface is described as showing horizontal striation, parallel marks running along the length of the wall at approximately chest height. These marks are not scratch marks from animal claws or from debris carried by ancient water flows. They are parallel, evenly spaced, consistent in depth, and they run horizontally, meaning they were made by someone or something moving along the length of the passage at roughly the same elevation. They look, in multiple accounts, like the marks left by tools being drawn across stone. Now here is the part that every account comes back to with something close to awe: the markings on the walls. Distinct from the tool mark striations, which appear to be functional features of the construction process, there are decorative or inscribed markings in multiple locations within the passage systems that are described in every account that gets far enough in to see them. These are not scattered marks. They are not random. They are arranged in what multiple accounts describe as rows and columns, groups of symbols or figures arranged in regular patterns that cover sections of wall in a way that feels deliberate and organized, the way text is organized on a page. Forsyth, who was the most systematic early documenter, spent considerable time in his 1924 book describing and attempting to sketch the wall markings his team photographed. His sketches, which were published in the book and which are reproduced in a few subsequent researchers' works that discuss Forsyth, show a variety of marks. Some are geometric, straight lines arranged in groups, angles, patterns of dots in regular arrays. Some appear to be figurative, representing shapes that could be animals or people or natural features, though Forsyth was careful not to claim firm interpretation of anything he could not confidently identify. And some, he wrote, resembled nothing he had seen in any indigenous artistic tradition he was familiar with, and nothing he had seen in any Old World script or symbol system he had encountered in his reading. That last category is the most provocative, and it is also the one that is most difficult to evaluate because we do not have the original photographs. We have only Forsyth's sketches, which are hand-drawn reproductions of photographs, not direct tracings. The loss of Forsyth's photographic plates from the University of Alberta archive is consequently one of the most significant specific losses in this entire documentary record. Those photographs, if they existed, and if they showed what Forsyth described, would be among the most important pieces of evidence in the entire debate. But we do have other accounts of the markings, including accounts from people who had no knowledge of Forsyth's work and who described essentially the same features, including accounts from indigenous informants collected by ethnographers who were not looking for corroboration of tunnel theories, but who were collecting traditional geographical knowledge. One of the most striking secondary accounts comes from a man named Edward Carey, who was a mining prospector working in the Kootenay region of British Columbia in the early 1900s. Carey was not an educated man, and his account, which survives in a letter he wrote to a newspaper editor in Nelson, BC, in 1907, is not polished, but it is specific. He describes entering what he initially thought was a natural cave while sheltering from a storm and finding himself in a passage that did not behave like any cave he had ever been in. He described the walls as having writing on them, though he was careful to note that he did not mean writing like English, more like figures or signs arranged in lines. He described them as being at eye level, as if placed to be read by someone of average height standing and walking along the passage. He described them as covering a section of wall roughly 20 feet long before the storm passed, and he left without going further. Carey was not writing for any theoretical purpose. He was writing to the newspaper because he wanted to know if anyone else had seen the same thing. He received no replies that he mentioned in any subsequent record. His letter is preserved in the Nelson Daily News archive. The accounts of the markings from indigenous sources are generally consistent with Carey's description and with Forsyth's documentation, but tend to provide more context about what the markings mean and who may have made them. Several Stoney Nakoda elders interviewed over the decades have described the wall markings as records, not story pictures in the sense of traditional pictographs, which in most Plains indigenous traditions are painted on rock surfaces with pigment. These are incised marks, cut into the stone, in a system that elder informants consistently describe as a form of recording information. Numbers, quantities, directions, and in some interpretations, names. The distinction between incised stone markings and painted pictographs is significant. Pictographic traditions are common across North American indigenous cultures, are well documented, and are understood. Incised systematic markings, arranged in rows and columns in the interior of underground passages, are not part of any documented North American indigenous tradition. which leads to one of two conclusions. Either the markings were made by people not belonging to any tradition that survived into the historical period, or the markings were made by people whose tradition was so thoroughly suppressed or disrupted that the specific practice of making them is no longer active, even though the memory of their existence is preserved in oral tradition. The second possibility is actually more common in history than people tend to think. Writing systems have been lost. Symbolic traditions have died with the communities that practice them. The absence of a contemporary tradition does not prove the absence of a historical one. And then there is the question of light. If the tunnels are extensive, running for the distances that multiple accounts suggest, then whoever was in them needed light. Significant, sustained light. Not a burning branch carried briefly into an opening. The kind of light infrastructure that would support people working and moving through passages for extended periods. Forsyth noted, in his book, the presence in several locations of what appeared to be niches cut into the walls at regular intervals at approximately shoulder height. He described them as being roughly the right size and shape to hold a lamp or a torch, and being positioned at intervals of approximately 30 to 40 feet along the passage walls. He could not prove they were lamp niches, but he could not explain them as natural features either. They were too regular, too consistent in size, and too consistently positioned to be accidental. Multiple subsequent accounts have noted similar features, not always described as lamp niches specifically, sometimes described simply as regularly spaced recesses in the walls, but the consistency of the feature across accounts is striking. Someone lit these passages from fixed points at regular intervals. That implies a degree of planning and ongoing use that goes well beyond a one-time exploration. That implies a community that was using these tunnels regularly, for extended periods, over a span of time long enough to develop infrastructure. The pre-Columbian question, here is where we have to slow down and think carefully, because everything in this story so far has been building toward a question that the evidence forces you to ask, but that the existing framework of North American history cannot answer without tearing itself apart at the seams. Who built them? The official consensus history of pre-Columbian North America, the one you learned in school, goes roughly like this. Human beings arrived in the Americas from Asia via the Bering Land Bridge during the last ice age, roughly 13,000 to 15,000 years ago, in the standard Clovis first model, or somewhat earlier in the revised models that have been gaining acceptance over the past 2 decades. They were nomadic hunter-gatherers. Over thousands of years, they spread south and east across the continents, developed diverse cultures, and in some regions, notably Mesoamerica and parts of South America, eventually developed complex civilizations with monumental architecture, writing systems, and sophisticated social organization. North of Mexico, and especially in the interior of the continent, the development was more modest. No cities, no writing, no monumental permanent construction. This is the framework, and the tunnels beneath the Canadian Rockies do not fit it. They do not fit it on chronological grounds. If the indigenous oral traditions are correct, that these tunnels predate the current world cycle, meaning they predate the most recent ice age, then they were made by people who were in North America before the conventional timeline allows for significant human presence. This does not mean the conventional timeline is entirely wrong, but it might mean it is more incomplete than the consensus is comfortable admitting. They do not fit it on technological grounds. Constructing passages of the scale and consistency described in the accounts requires tools, organization, and engineering knowledge that the standard narrative does not assign to the peoples of pre-Columbian North America. Not in this region, not at this scale, not underground, and they do not fit it on cultural grounds. The wall markings, if they represent a systematic, incised recording tradition, imply a level of symbolic communication infrastructure that does not appear in the recognized cultural record of pre-Columbian North America, north of Mexico. The uncomfortable implication is that there was, at some point in the past, a people or a culture operating in the Rocky Mountain region that was significantly more sophisticated than anything the official historical narrative acknowledges. A culture that could engineer underground corridor systems, that maintain them with light infrastructure, that use them for regular transit and possibly for ceremonial purposes, that recorded information on their walls in a systematic notation, and that, at some point, stopped or left or was ended. Who were they? The honest answer is that we do not know, and anyone who tells you with confidence that they know is overstating what the evidence actually supports. But there are several lines of investigation that researchers have pursued over the years that are worth examining carefully because they point toward possibilities that are increasingly difficult to dismiss. The first and most archaeologically defensible possibility is that the tunnels represent the work of a pre-Clovis North American culture. The conventional wisdom on pre-Clovis occupation of North America has been changing rapidly in the past 20 years. The 2016 formal acceptance by mainstream archaeology of the Monteverde site in Chile, which has occupation layers dating to at least 18,500 years ago, was a watershed moment. It proved conclusively that humans were in South America before the Clovis timeline allowed for them to have arrived. Subsequent work at sites across North and South America has pushed human presence in the Americas back considerably further than the old model admitted. If human beings were in the Americas 20,000 or 25,000 years ago, they had a very long time before the conventional historical record begins. They had time to develop cultures, technologies, and infrastructure that left traces which the subsequent glacial period largely erased. The landscape of the Canadian Rockies at the end of the last ice age looked nothing like it does today. When the ice retreated, it left behind a terrain that was radically altered. Moraines, meltwater floods, isostatic rebound, as the weight of ice was removed from the land. Much of what existed before the glaciation was buried or destroyed or reshaped beyond recognition. If sophisticated cultures existed in or near the Rockies before the last glacial maximum, we would expect their surface-level traces to have been largely obliterated. What would survive is precisely what is underground, what is carved in stone, what is below the level of glacial disturbance. The tunnels, in this interpretation, are not mysteries at all. They are the geological analogue of a city buried under volcanic ash. The surface civilization is gone. What remains is the infrastructure that was dug into bedrock and therefore survived what the surface world did not. The second line of investigation is more controversial and takes us into territory that mainstream archaeology is even more reluctant to engage with. It concerns the question of transoceanic contact in pre-Columbian North America. The academic consensus on pre-Columbian transoceanic contact has shifted more than many people realize. The Norse presence in North America, centered on the Lance Oak Meadows site in Newfoundland, dated to around 1000 CE, is now completely accepted. There is growing, though still debated, evidence for Polynesian contact with the west coast of South America prior to European arrival. There is serious ongoing scholarly debate about possible Chinese maritime contact with the Americas in the pre-Columbian period, and there is a persistent body of evidence, largely generated outside mainstream academic channels but not without substance, for contact between specific Old World cultures and specific regions of pre-Columbian North America. The relevance to the tunnel question is this. If the wall markings in the passages include symbols that bear resemblance to, or are directly comparable with, known Old World symbolic systems, that would be significant evidence. Forsyth believed some of the markings he documented resembled Phoenician or related Semitic script forms. He was careful not to claim identification, but he noted the resemblance in his book. Other researchers, working from Forsyth's sketches and from independent accounts, have noted possible correspondences with Ogham script from the Irish Celtic tradition, with certain Iberian scripts from pre-Roman Iberia, and with some early Chinese pictographic forms. These comparisons are extraordinarily difficult to evaluate fairly. Pattern matching between symbol systems is a notoriously unreliable methodology. The human brain is excellent at finding resemblances, whether they exist or not, and the researchers who have made these comparisons have generally been working from secondary sources, from sketches and descriptions, rather than direct examination of the actual markings. Without the original photographs, without a comprehensive, systematic study of the actual wall surfaces, these comparisons are suggestive at best and misleading at worst. But they are not nothing, and they point toward the possibility that cannot be dismissed without examination, that the people who made these tunnels had contact with, or were themselves from, or were culturally descended from, traditions that also operated in the Old World. That the Rockies may have been a meeting point, or a destination, or a through route for cultures whose range was wider than the standard narrative allows. The third possibility is perhaps the most challenging to consider, because it sits at the intersection of conventional archaeology and genuine uncertainty about the very deep past. It is the possibility that the tunnels are genuinely ancient in a way that would require us to rethink not just the conventional timeline of human presence in North America, but the conventional understanding of human cognitive and organizational development worldwide. If the passages are, as the Blackfoot elder Bull Plume told the missionary Kipling, older than the mountains themselves, or more precisely, older than the current form of the mountains, we are talking about construction that could predate the Laramide orogeny, the mountain-building event that happened between 70 and 50 million years ago. No human beings existed 50 million years ago. No hominids of any kind existed 50 million years ago. So that interpretation cannot be literally true in the way Kipling understood it. But there is another way to understand the statement. The limestone that forms the Rockies is old, as we noted earlier, dating to the Devonian period in many places. If passages were made in that limestone before the mountain-building event deformed and elevated it, they would technically predate the mountains as we know them. The rock containing them would be the same rock, but in a different orientation and position than it was when the passages were made. This is geologically possible, fantastically unlikely as a scenario for human-made passages, given the timeline, but geologically possible. And it might be what oral tradition is actually preserving as knowledge about very deep time, the understanding that these passages are in rock that existed long before the landscape it currently forms part of. There is also a more modest version of this interpretation that does not require anything nearly so dramatic. If the passages were made during a glacial period when the mountains were buried under kilometers of ice, they would have been made in a geological and geographical context so alien to the current landscape that in a meaningful sense, the mountains as living, accessible terrain did not exist yet when they were made. The world that the passage builders inhabited was not the Rockies as we know them. It was an ice-buried, ice-shaped, ice-dominated landscape in which the only inhabitable zones were the ice-free refugia, the pockets of exposed terrain that survived glaciation, and some of those refugia were precisely in the limestone karst regions of the southern Rockies, where the tunnels are concentrated. This is the version of the story that a cautious, evidence-respecting researcher can sit with most comfortably. A pre-Clovis, Ice Age culture operating in the refugia of the southern Rockies, using the existing natural cave systems as the foundation for an engineered underground network that served as transit infrastructure during a period when surface travel was limited by ice, cold, and predators. A culture sophisticated enough to engineer tunnel systems, to develop symbolic recording traditions, to maintain light infrastructure in underground passages, and to build knowledge about the tunnels into oral traditions robust enough to survive the end of the Ice Age, the dramatic landscape transformation that followed, and 10,000 years of subsequent history, that culture exists in no textbook. It has no conventional name. It left almost no surface traces because its world was primarily below the surface, or in refugia that were subsequently transformed beyond recognition. All it left, reliably, was what it carved into bedrock, and what it inscribed into the memories of the peoples who followed after it, as stories about the old ones who made the roads under the mountains, and whose work can still be found if you know where to look. The Ottawa silence. Let's talk about the silence, because the silence is its own kind of evidence. In 2003, a coalition of First Nations groups from Alberta and British Columbia filed a series of land claims before the Canadian courts, citing, among other evidence, the existence of pre-Columbian construction in the Canadian Rockies as evidence of sophisticated prior occupation. The claims specifically referenced the tunnel systems as physical evidence of a level of cultural and technological development that challenged the legal and historical basis for the original land cessions made in Treaty 7 and related agreements in the 1870s. The federal government's response to this aspect of the claims was to neither confirm nor deny the existence of the tunnel formations. Instead, the government's legal team argued that the evidence of tunnel systems presented by the First Nations groups was insufficient, speculative, and based on inadequate archaeological documentation. The First Nations groups had submitted oral history testimony, the documentary evidence from Forsyth and others, and had specifically requested government access to the Bell 1887 sealed report to establish what official geological surveys had found. The request for the Bell report was denied. The court ruled that the government had adequately demonstrated that the report was legitimately withheld under the access exemption for records that could be injurious to the Crown's interests in relation to land claims. It is a circular argument that would be comic if the stakes were not so high. The evidence that would most directly address the claims is withheld on the grounds that it might support the claims. The claims, therefore, cannot be proven to the court's satisfaction because the best evidence for them is classified. The classification of the evidence is therefore never challenged on its merits because the case that would challenge it fails for lack of evidence. This is how institutional suppression works in a democratic society with a functional legal system. It is not crude. It does not require anyone to lie. It requires only that the rules governing access to evidence be structured in a way that systematically disadvantages the parties who need the evidence most. And it works because it is invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. The federal government's approach to the tunnel question since the early 20th century has been characterized by three consistent strategies. The first is what we might call the reclassification strategy. Documents that touch on the anomalous tunnel formations are classified or restricted, either originally or at some point after their creation, under various protective categories. The Bell Report is the clearest example, but it is not the only one. Several other geological survey documents from the 1890s through the 1940s that researchers have identified as potentially relevant to the tunnel question have been found to be either missing from the archive, restricted under legacy classifications, or catalogued in ways that make them difficult to find without already knowing specifically what you are looking for. The second strategy is what we might call the funding problem. Independent academic research into the tunnel question has faced consistent difficulties in obtaining funding through conventional channels. Canadian research funding agencies, including the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council and the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, have no formal policy excluding tunnel-related research. But in practice, researchers who have attempted to get grants for systematic investigation of the anomalous passage formations have found their applications consistently unsuccessful. The stated reasons vary. Methodological concerns, lack of preliminary data, insufficient theoretical framework. The unstated but consistently operative factor, as several researchers have noted on the record in personal communications and in published reflections on their careers, is that this is a topic institutional gatekeepers do not want to pursue. Patricia Gould's career is illustrative. She was a tenure-track professor at a Canadian university when she published her 2001 paper documenting her attempts to access the Bell Report and arguing for the significance of the suppressed documentary record. Within 2 years of that publication, she was denied tenure. The stated reasons were related to research productivity, not this specific paper. But the timing was noted by her colleagues and by the broader academic community. She continued her research independently after leaving the university, publishing through small academic presses and in non-mainstream journals, producing work of serious, scholarly quality that received virtually no engagement from mainstream Canadian historiography or geology. She died in 2011 having never achieved formal recognition within the institutions whose validation would have made her work harder to dismiss. The third strategy is the most subtle and in some ways the most effective. It is the strategy of not engaging at all. The tunnel question does not appear in the standard histories of the Canadian Rockies. It does not appear in the standard accounts of Canadian geological exploration. It does not appear in the public educational curricula about pre-Columbian North America in Canada. It does not appear in the National Park's interpretive materials about the geology and history of the Rocky Mountain Parks, which receive millions of visitors annually. It does not exist in the official account as a question worth asking. When something does not appear in the standard reference sources, when it is not cited in mainstream academic literature, when it is absent from the educational frameworks through which most people learn about the world, it effectively becomes invisible to everyone who is not specifically looking for it. The absence of the tunnel question from official discourse is not the result of the question having been examined and found wanting. It is the result of the question never having been examined at all by the institutions that have the resources, access, and authority to examine it definitively. And this is the dynamic that frustrates the researchers who have spent decades on this subject. Not that their work has been considered and rejected, that it has been systematically kept out of the spaces where it might be considered. The Geological Survey of Canada has the resources and the mandate to conduct a thorough, systematic investigation of the passage formations in the Rockies. The federal archives contain documents that could clarify what early government surveys actually found. The university departments of geology and archaeology across Canada have the technical capacity to date and analyze the physical features of the passages in ways that would produce definitive answers to the most important questions. None of this work has been done, not because it cannot be done, because no one with the institutional authority to commission it has chosen to do so. That is not a passive outcome. That is a choice, made repeatedly over more than a century by institutions and individuals who understand, even if they have never said it explicitly, that the questions raised by the tunnel formations are questions with potentially very large consequences. Consequences for land claims cases, consequences for the constitutional status of Indigenous peoples in Canada, consequences for the legal basis of the Canadian state's claims to sovereignty over territory in Western Canada, consequences, in other words, for who gets to own what. The silence from Ottawa is not the silence of ignorance. It is the silence of people who know that certain questions, once officially asked, may not produce answers that can be officially managed. In the absence of official engagement, the investigation of the tunnel question has been left to independent researchers, to Indigenous knowledge keepers, and to the odd, brave, professionally marginalized scientists who have continued to push at the edges of what the institutional framework will acknowledge. Their work is the best evidence we have. And it is, even in its gapped and incomplete state, more than sufficient to establish that something genuine is here, and that the silence around it is itself one of the most significant facts in the story, the second wave. The period between roughly 1920 and 1960 saw a significant second wave of independent investigation into the Rocky Mountain tunnel systems. The first wave had been largely a product of the railway and mining expansion era, a byproduct of people going into the mountains for economic reasons and finding things that didn't fit the official map. The second wave was more deliberate. People who had heard the stories and who specifically wanted to find out if they were true. The context for this second wave is partly the general cultural ferment of the interwar period, when popular interest in alternative history and archaeological mystery was high, fueled by discoveries like Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, and by a general sense that the official version of the past was probably not telling the whole story. But it was also partly the result of the expanding road network in the Rockies, which from the 1920s onward was beginning to open up terrain that previously had required serious wilderness expedition skills to access. As the Trans-Canada Highway took shape and as the Rocky Mountain Parks developed their infrastructure, more and more people were getting into terrain where the tunnel entrances had historically been located. The most systematic effort of this period was organized by a man named Frederick Wallace, a Toronto businessman with a serious amateur interest in prehistory and the resources to fund his own investigations. Wallace had read Forsyth's 1924 book and had been in correspondence with Forsyth before Forsyth's death in 1939. He knew the existing documentary record well, and he had also been quietly collecting new accounts from his own network of contacts in Alberta and British Columbia. Wallace mounted his first expedition into the Rockies in 1931 and made 3 more trips in subsequent years, through 1938. His papers are held by his family and have never been systematically examined by a professional archivist, but a descendant of Wallace, who became interested in his work, allowed a researcher named David Hamill to review them in the early 2000s, and Hamill published an account of what he found in a small press book in 2004 that has circulated primarily among enthusiasts rather than in academic channels. What Hamill found in Wallace's papers was a detailed, methodical record of a serious investigation. Wallace was not credulous. His notebooks are full of skeptical notes, of instances where he went to investigate a reported passage and found only natural cave formations that he was satisfied could be explained geologically. He was not looking for mystery. He was looking for evidence, and he found some. The most significant thing Hamill found in Wallace's papers was a collection of photographs that Wallace had taken on his 1933 expedition. The photographs are, by the standards of 2024, low resolution and technically imperfect. They were taken with a 1930s camera in the dim conditions of a lantern-lit underground passage. But they show something. They show a wall surface, and on the wall surface, clearly visible even in the degraded prints that are all Hamill had access to, are markings, arranged in horizontal rows, incised into the stone, in a section of wall that appears from the surrounding rock to be limestone of the same character as the surrounding geological formation. Hamill, who is not a specialist in epigraphy or in pre-Columbian archaeology, spent time comparing the shapes in Wallace's photographs to various known symbol systems. He was cautious in his conclusions, more cautious than Forsyth had been. He said that the shapes did not obviously correspond to any known North American indigenous pictographic tradition that he could identify, that some of the geometric forms might be coincidentally similar to various Old World symbol systems, and that the only responsible conclusion he could draw was that the markings were made by hand, were arranged intentionally, and were not explicable as natural features of the rock surface. He also noted something else in Wallace's papers that had not been part of any previous account. Wallace had, on his 1933 expedition, brought with him a geologist friend whose name Hamill gave as Thomas Reeves, a retired professor from the University of Toronto. Reeves spent several days examining the passage systems that Wallace had access to, and he wrote a letter to Wallace after returning to Toronto that is preserved in the family papers. In the letter, Reeves gave his geological assessment of the passage formation. He was not equivocal. He wrote that in his professional judgment, the passage could not have been formed by natural geological processes, and that the most reasonable hypothesis was that it had been created by human action at an undetermined time in the past. He wrote that he was not willing to publish this assessment because he had no framework for explaining who had done this or when, and because, at his age and with his career behind him, he saw no reason to invite the professional ridicule that such a claim would attract. But he wrote it in a private letter to Wallace as his honest professional conclusion. Thomas Reeves, a retired professor from the University of Toronto, who examined the passage in 1933 and concluded privately that it was human-made. His conclusion is available in a family archive that most researchers don't know about. His public record contains no mention of the passages. The second wave also brought a new category of witness into the story, men who had served in the First and Second World Wars and who had experience of underground fortifications, dugouts, tunnel systems, bomb shelters, men who knew what it looked like when humans dug into rock and shaped it for habitation and movement. Several veterans of the two wars, who subsequently worked in or travelled through the Rockies, wrote accounts or gave interviews, describing their reaction to the underground passages they encountered. And their reactions consistently involved recognition, not the recognition of having seen this place before, the recognition of having seen this kind of construction before. The recognition, as one veteran named Leonard Forsyth described it in a letter to a Calgary newspaper in 1952, of being in a place that had been made for people to move through. The way a trench was made for people to move through. Leonard Forsyth was not related to Gerald Forsyth, the researcher, as far as anyone has been able to determine. He was a farmer from southern Alberta who had served in the Second World War, had been involved in tunnel construction in fortified positions in Europe, and who had stumbled upon one of the passage entrances while hiking in the mountains near Banff. His letter was published in the Calgary Herald in 1952 and provoked a brief flurry of correspondence, most of it skeptical or dismissive, before the subject faded from the newspaper's pages. He was not an academic. He had no credibility in the channels where credibility is officially conferred. But he had something more direct than academic credibility. He had walked through military tunnels, and he was telling anyone who would listen that what he had walked into in the Rockies felt the same. The account that arguably attracted the most attention in this period, though still not mainstream attention, came from a journalist named Albert Sinclair, who wrote for several Western Canadian newspapers in the 1940s and 1950s. Sinclair was the kind of reporter who went looking for stories that didn't fit the official line, and he spent several years collecting accounts of the tunnel passages, eventually publishing a 3-part series in a Vancouver newspaper in 1954 titled The Mystery Under the Mountains, which is one of the more substantial pieces of popular journalism about the subject from the 20th century. Sinclair spent time in the field, interviewed Indigenous elders, tracked down several surviving accounts from earlier in the century, and attempted to get official comment from the Geological Survey of Canada and from the Federal Department of Mines and Technical Surveys. He received form letter, non-responses from both. His series describes what he found with care and some journalistic restraint, presenting the evidence without excessive sensationalism and concluding that the passages exist, that they show features inconsistent with natural formation, and that the refusal of official bodies to engage with the subject is itself a significant fact requiring explanation. The series received no formal response from any scientific institution. It was not cited in subsequent academic literature. It did not prompt any official investigation. It was read by people who were already interested in the subject and ignored by people who were not. And Albert Sinclair moved on to other stories, and the tunnels went back into the silence of the mountains. Physical evidence. Let's take stock of what the physical evidence, as documented across a century of accounts, actually consists of, because it is more substantial than the institutional silence around it would suggest, and it is worth laying out clearly the passages themselves. The existence of anomalous passages in the limestone of the Canadian Rockies that do not correspond to expected natural dissolution cave morphology is documented in geological field reports going back to the 1880s, in independent accounts from prospectors, surveyors, and other workers going back to the same period, in Indigenous oral tradition extending back as far as the tradition runs, and in a small number of photographs that survive from the 20th century investigation period. The location of these passages is not precisely public knowledge. The entrances are not marked on any public map. The national parks have not incorporated them into any interpretive framework. But multiple independent investigators over multiple decades have found them, entered them, and described them in consistent terms. Their existence is not seriously in doubt among the researchers who have worked on this question. The dimensions. The consistent cross-section of the main passages, roughly 10 to 14 feet wide and 7 to 9 feet high, is documented in enough independent sources, with specific measurements to be treated as a real physical characteristic of these formations. Natural cave systems do not maintain consistent dimensions over extended distances. The consistency of these dimensions strongly implies deliberate construction, the floor preparation, the level cleared floor surface is noted in the majority of accounts that describe the interior of the passages in any detail. Natural cave floors in limestone environments are covered with speleothems, breakdown material, sediment deposits, and flowstone. The cleared, level floors described in the tunnel accounts are incompatible with the natural cave floor environment that would develop over long periods in the absence of human maintenance. The wall surface, the smoother than natural wall surface, is consistently noted. While natural dissolution can produce smooth surfaces in some conditions, the specific combination of consistency over long stretches, horizontal orientation of the smooth zone, and the apparent tool mark striations described in multiple accounts is not characteristic of any documented natural dissolution process in comparable limestone environments. The markings. This is the most evidentially significant and the most difficult category to evaluate because the best physical documentation of the markings, Forsyth's photographs, is not available. What we have are Forsyth's sketches, Wallace's photographs, and written descriptions from multiple independent sources spanning several decades. The consistency of these descriptions across independent accounts, particularly regarding the organized row and column arrangement of the marks and their incised rather than painted character, is significant. The interpretation of specific mark shapes as belonging to identifiable symbol systems remains uncertain and controversial. The conclusion that the marks are of human origin and intentional arrangement is consistent across every account that describes them. The lamp niches, or wall recesses. Noted by Forsyth and in several subsequent accounts, the regularly spaced recesses at shoulder height along the passage walls represent a feature that has no natural formation analogue, and that is consistent with deliberate provision of fixed-point illumination infrastructure. The relationship to natural cave systems. A feature noted by several researchers and worth emphasizing is that the anomalous passages do not exist in isolation. They connect to, and in some cases, branch from natural cave formations in the same limestone. This has led some researchers to suggest that the passage builders were not constructing from scratch in solid rock, but were working with, extending, and modifying existing natural cave systems. This is technologically more feasible than constructing entirely new passages, and would explain both why the passages exist in areas where natural caves are already present, and why the distinction between natural and constructed sections can sometimes be difficult to determine from within the passage. The relationship to indigenous occupation sites. Several of the passage entrance locations that researchers have documented are in proximity to known or suspected prehistoric indigenous occupation sites, not immediately adjacent, and not in ways that would necessarily suggest a direct connection, but in the same general geographical zones that show other evidence of pre-Columbian activity. This geographical correspondence does not prove anything on its own, but it is consistent with the hypothesis that the passages were made by and used by peoples who were also leaving surface traces in the same regions. The geological age question. This is the most technically difficult physical evidence question, and it is one that has not been definitively addressed, precisely because no systematic scientific study of the passages has been conducted. Dating the passages requires establishing when the wall surface was last modified, which can in principle be done through analysis of the crystalline overgrowth on the incised marks, or through uranium-thorium, dating of speleothem deposits on the floors and walls. These techniques exist and are used routinely in cave archaeology. They have never been applied to the Rocky Mountain tunnel passages, not because they cannot be, but because no funded scientific study has been conducted. The question of how old these passages are is therefore genuinely unanswered, not answered negatively, simply not answered. If such a study were conducted and produced a date within the range of known human occupation of North America, roughly the last 15,000 to 20,000 years, it would constitute major evidence of pre-Columbian construction in the Canadian Rockies. If it produced a date significantly older than that, it would be among the most significant and disruptive findings in the history of archaeology. Either outcome would be scientifically important. Both outcomes are currently prevented from occurring by the persistent absence of funding and institutional authorization for the study. There is one piece of physical evidence that sits somewhat outside the general framework of the passage documentation and that deserves specific attention. In 1947, a man named William Carpenter, who was working as a surveyor for a mining company operating in the Kootenay region of British Columbia, documented what he described as an artifact recovered from near the entrance of one of the passage formations. Carpenter was not an archaeologist, and he did not treat the artifact with the care that an archaeologist would. But he described it in a report to his employer, and the description was specific enough to be meaningful. The artifact was a tool, a stone implement of roughly hand-axe shape, made from a material that Carpenter described as a very dark, almost black rock that he could not identify as local to the area. He described it as clearly shaped by knapping, meaning the application of controlled force to remove flakes from the surface to create a working edge, and as showing a degree of workmanship that he described as surprisingly fine. He kept the artifact. It went into his personal possession. What happened to it after his death in the 1960s is not known. No subsequent researcher has been able to locate it. An unlocatable artifact described by a non-specialist in a corporate report is not strong evidence. Carpenter's description is preserved only as hearsay, filtered through 2 layers of secondary documentation. But it is notable for one specific feature: the material he described, a very dark, almost black stone that he could not identify as local. In the limestone country of the Kootenay region, the common local stone materials available for toolmaking are not dark. They are grey, beige, and brown. Dark, non-local stone material at a passage entrance would suggest either trade connections, bringing exotic material into the region, or the use of material from sources outside the immediately surrounding geological formation. Either interpretation implies a level of connection and organization that goes beyond local cave use by small bands of hunter-gatherers. Obsidian, volcanic glass, is dark, almost black, and was a prized tool-making material across much of North America and the world because of its extremely sharp fracture edge. The nearest significant obsidian sources to the southern Canadian Rockies are in the Columbia Plateau region to the south and west, and in the Yellowstone area further south. Trade networks moving obsidian into the Rocky Mountain region are known from the pre-Columbian record, but they are associated with later cultural periods. Obsidian, at the entrance to an anomalous passage formation, is consistent with the passage being used by cultures that were embedded in regional trade networks. It does not prove anything definitive, but it fits the pattern. Theories. Let us now look at the major theoretical frameworks that researchers have proposed for understanding the Rocky Mountain tunnel passages, ranging from the most conservative to the most speculative, and assess what the evidence does and does not support in each case. The natural formation hypothesis. The most conservative position, and the one that official institutions have implicitly endorsed through their silence, is that there is no genuine mystery here. The passages are natural dissolution cave systems, perhaps somewhat unusual in their morphology, but ultimately explicable within standard karst geology. The features that seem anomalous, the consistent dimensions, the smooth walls, the level floors, the apparent markings, are all within the range of natural variation in limestone cave systems and have been misinterpreted by observers without adequate geological training. This position is difficult to sustain against the evidence. George Mercer Dawson had adequate geological training. Charles Elmore of UBC had adequate geological training. Thomas Reeves, the retired University of Toronto professor, had adequate geological training. All 3 independently concluded that what they were looking at was not adequately explained by natural formation. The consistent dimensions argument is particularly strong against the natural formation hypothesis. Natural caves simply do not maintain the described cross-sectional consistency over the distances documented in the accounts. And the wall markings, whether or not they can be identified as belonging to any specific symbolic system, are not a product of natural geological process in any formation type that has been described in the scientific literature. The natural formation hypothesis requires us to assume that a large number of independent observers with various levels of relevant expertise all made the same error in the same way across a period of over 100 years. This is not impossible, but it requires a level of coincidence that becomes harder to accept as the number of independent accounts accumulates. The known indigenous construction hypothesis. A slightly less conservative position holds that the passages are the work of known pre-Columbian indigenous cultures of the region, specifically the ancestors of the contemporary First Nations peoples of the area. Under this hypothesis, tunnel construction was a practice of pre-contact indigenous cultures that has not survived into the documented historical period and is therefore unknown to mainstream archaeology. The oral traditions of the Blackfoot, Cree, Stoney Nakoda, and other regional nations represent cultural memory of this construction activity. This is a more defensible position than the natural formation hypothesis, but it still has problems. The scale and technical sophistication implied by the passage systems go beyond anything in the documented archaeological record for these cultures. The wall markings in an organized row and column system are not consistent with any known indigenous pictographic or inscriptive tradition from this region, and the oral traditions themselves, consistently across multiple cultures, describe the passages as having been made by people who came before the ancestors of contemporary indigenous peoples, not by the cultural ancestors of those peoples. The oral traditions do not claim credit for the construction. They describe it as something they inherited and about which they preserved knowledge, but which they did not make. The pre-Clovis North American culture hypothesis. This is the position that the most careful and evidence-respecting researchers in this field have converged on. The tunnels were made by a culture, or cultures, occupying the Canadian Rockies region in the pre-Clovis or early post-Clovis period, meaning before and around the end of the last glacial maximum, by peoples whose existence in North America predates the conventional archaeological record and whose civilizational development was significantly more sophisticated than the standard model allows for. This hypothesis is consistent with the geological evidence, with the oral traditions, with the documentary record, and with recent shifts in mainstream archaeological thinking about the timeline and sophistication of pre-Columbian North American cultures. It requires no exotic or supernatural agencies. It requires only that the standard history of North American pre-contact cultures is incomplete in ways that an increasing body of evidence supports. This is the hypothesis that should be driving a serious, funded, systematic investigation of the passages, and it is the hypothesis that the institutional silence has consistently prevented from being properly evaluated. The transoceanic contact hypothesis. More speculative and more contested is the hypothesis that the tunnel construction or use involved peoples from outside North America, whether through migration from Asia by routes other than the Bering Land Bridge, through pre-Columbian contact with European, African, or Asian seafaring cultures, or through the survival in the Rockies of a cultural tradition with Old World roots that is not currently recognized. The evidence for this hypothesis is the wall markings, specifically the possible resemblances to Old World symbolic systems. This hypothesis cannot be evaluated fairly without a proper epigraphic study of the actual wall surfaces by qualified specialists in ancient writing systems. Forsyth sketches are not an adequate basis for such analysis. Wallace's photographs, even if they could be improved with modern enhancement techniques, are not adequate for systematic epigraphy. Until the actual walls can be systematically documented and the markings compared against the full range of Old World and New World symbolic traditions by qualified specialists working from high-resolution primary documentation, the transoceanic contact hypothesis should be held in suspension. It should be neither embraced nor dismissed. It should be filed under questions the evidence raises that we cannot currently answer. The deep time hypothesis. The most speculative of the serious hypotheses is the one that takes the indigenous oral tradition most literally. The claim that the passages are older than the mountains themselves, understood either as a literal geological statement about the rock predating the mountain-building event, or as a more metaphorical statement about the passages predating the current world cycle, implies a degree of antiquity that would require a fundamental rethinking of the timeline of human development worldwide, not just in North America. This hypothesis is not currently supportable by the available evidence in a way that would satisfy any scientific standard. What would be required to evaluate it is systematic radiometric dating of the wall surfaces and of mineral deposits within the passages, conducted by specialists and with methodology transparent enough to withstand critique. This study has not been done. The hypothesis, therefore, remains genuinely open. The important point about all of these hypotheses is that they are not mutually exclusive in their weakest forms. The passages could be largely the work of a pre-Clovis North American culture, with some evidence of later modification or use by subsequent cultures, including the ancestors of contemporary indigenous peoples, and with some features that suggest connections to wider trade or cultural networks. History is rarely simple. The underground is full of palimpsests, layers of use from different periods. The tunnels of the Canadian Rockies may be the same. The living memory, through all the layers of documentary history, suppressed reports, lost archives, and institutional silence, one thread has remained alive and continuous. The living memory of the indigenous peoples of the Rocky Mountain region. This is not a decorative addition to the story. It is the most important part of it. For all the significance of the documentary record from European sources, for all the interest of the suppressed geological reports and the lost photographs and the sealed archive documents, the oral traditions of the Blackfoot, the Cree, the Stoney Nakoda, the Kootenai, and other peoples of the region represent a form of documentation that no institutional force has been able to suppress. They are in the minds and mouths of living people. They are passed from grandparent to grandchild, in languages that are themselves survivors of sustained official effort to extinguish them. They have outlasted the residential school system, the cultural destruction policies, and the systematic denial of Indigenous historical and cultural authority that characterized Canadian government policy for most of the 20th century. And what the living memory says, consistently, across different nations, speaking different languages, with different specific traditions, is that the passages are real, that they are ancient, that they were made by people who were here before the current world, and that they were made for purposes that went beyond simple shelter or transit. Purposes that included the movement of sacred knowledge, the preservation of important objects, and forms of ritual and ceremony that connected the human world to deeper layers of the world's structure. Doris Wolfe, a Blackfoot elder from the Kainai Nation in southern Alberta, spoke at a land claims hearing in 2004 and gave testimony that was recorded in the court transcript. She described, in clear and specific terms, the passages beneath the mountains. She did not use the word tunnels. She used a Blackfoot term that she translated as the deep roads. She said the deep roads were made by the ones who came before the Blackfoot, not before her grandparents. Not before her great-grandparents' great-grandparents, but before the Blackfoot existed as a people. Before the world was arranged the way it is now. She said the Blackfoot learned about the deep roads from the people they found living near the mountains when the Blackfoot first came to that country, and that those people were already very old and going away when the Blackfoot arrived. She said the deep roads were not supposed to be used by people who did not know their purpose, and that the rules about entering them were very precise and had to be followed exactly, or the person who went in would not come back out. She was asked by the court whether she had personally been inside the passages. She said that she had not, that only certain people were supposed to enter them, that the knowledge of who those people were and how to prepare for the entry was no longer fully available, that it had been damaged by the residential school era, that the people who should have been taught were instead taken away and taught other things, and that the loss of that specific knowledge was among the deepest losses her community had suffered, though it was not among the losses that anyone in the outside world was paying attention to. That testimony is in the public court record. It is available, and it is one of the most significant pieces of documentation in this entire story because it connects the physical mystery of the tunnels to a living community, to a specific cultural loss, to the ongoing consequences of the colonial history that this entire question is embedded in. Joseph Swiftwind, a Cree elder from a community in the Alberta foothills, gave an extended interview to an independent documentary filmmaker named Mira Chen in 2009 that was subsequently released online. Swiftwind described what he called the below-ground world in the mountains. He said it was a place his grandfather had told him about, and his grandfather's grandfather before that. He described it as having been used in the old time for the movement of important things between communities during winter when the mountain passes were closed. Not every community knew how to use it. Only certain families, certain lineages, had the knowledge of the entrances and the knowledge of how to move through the network without getting lost. He said the network was bigger than people thought, that it was not just passages in one mountain, that it connected through the rock under many mountains over a distance he described in terms that suggested hundreds of kilometers. He described the people who maintained this knowledge in the old time as a kind of guild or society, a special group within the larger community, who were responsible for the below-ground ways and who underwent particular training and particular obligations in connection with that responsibility. He said the knowledge of the below-ground ways was the most valuable thing this society held, more valuable than horses, more valuable than weapons, because it gave its holders an ability to move through the mountains that no one who did not have the knowledge could replicate or counter. He said that when this society began to break down, in the period of the great deaths from European diseases in the 18th and 19th centuries, the knowledge began to fragment, with different families holding different portions of it, unable to reconstruct the whole, because the people who held the connecting pieces had died. He said that what remained in his community was enough to know that the below-ground ways existed and to know the location of certain entrances, but not enough to navigate safely through the full extent of the network. He also described, briefly and with some hesitation, as if uncertain whether to say it, that the below-ground ways were associated with an older people who had made them, not the Cree, not the peoples whose territory bordered theirs. An older people. He called them the first diggers. He said the Cree did not make the below-ground ways. They found them. They learned to use them. The first diggers were gone long before the Cree arrived in the mountains, but the memory of them was kept because the work they left behind was kept, and you could not use the work without keeping the memory of who made it. The first diggers made roads beneath the mountains, were gone long before the Cree arrived, but left work behind that was good enough for subsequent peoples to use for centuries. This is not mythology. This is the kind of specific, functional cultural memory that oral traditions preserve when they are preserving knowledge about real things. The distinction in the Cree testimony between the Cree themselves, the peoples who held access to the passages, and the first diggers who originally made them, is exactly the kind of layered attribution you would expect from a genuine historical tradition. Myths tend to appropriate construction. They attribute great works to cultural heroes or ancestors. They do not typically say, our culture found something that someone else made, and we learned to use it. That is a statement that comes from a tradition of accuracy, not a tradition of myth-making. Rose Little Thunder, a Stoney Nakoda knowledge keeper from the Eden Valley Reserve in Alberta, gave an extended interview to researchers from the University of Alberta in 2012 as part of an oral history project that was published in a small academic volume in 2015. In her portion of the interview, she described what she called the stone roads beneath the world. She said that in the time of her grandparents, the knowledge of the stone roads was held by certain families and passed from grandmother to granddaughter or grandfather to grandson in a specific ceremonial context. She described the ceremonies as involving a period of preparation, of fasting and prayer, and of specific teachings about the stone roads that were given in the context of these ceremonies. She said that the stone roads themselves were the reason her people had been able to survive in the mountains over many generations, that the knowledge of them was protective, not just practically because of the ability to move through winter terrain, but spiritually because the stone roads connected the human world to the deeper layers of the world that sustained it. She described the deeper layers in terms that suggest something like a layered cosmology, the world above the surface, the world within the mountains, and the world beneath everything, the deep world, to which the stone roads were a form of connection, a way of touching what was oldest about the land. She said that the stone roads were older than time, as people counted it, that they were made in a time before time, that the first diggers were not people in the ordinary sense, but were something between the ordinary world and the deep world, and that what they made partook of both. When the interviewer asked her to be more specific about what she meant by not people in the ordinary sense, she paused for a long time, and then said that she did not have the words in English to say it correctly, and that in Stony the concept she was trying to describe did not separate spirit and physical the way English did. She said the first diggers were as physical as the mountains and as present in the spirit world as the most commanding spiritual beings, and that this combination was what gave their work its enduring quality. She said that if you went into the stone roads without understanding this, without knowing how to be in both worlds at once, you would not be able to use them correctly. You might enter and not find the exit. This is testimony from a living person, recorded with her consent, about knowledge that has been in her community for as long as the community exists. It is not archaeological data. It is not geological evidence. It is human testimony about lived cultural reality. And it is, in its own way, as significant as any of the geological reports or documentary history, because it represents the voice of the people who have lived longest with this knowledge, who have kept it through the longest period of adversity, and who are still here to speak about what they know. The living memory is not mythology, it is history, the oldest and most continuous form of history available in this part of the world. And it says, clearly and consistently, that the tunnels are real, that they are ancient, that they were made by beings who came before, and that they are still there, beneath the mountains, waiting for someone to approach them with the right combination of respect, knowledge, and intention. Conclusion. We are at the end of a very long journey through the documentary and oral history of something that officially does not exist. Something that the institutional machinery of government, academia, and mainstream culture has spent over 100 years declining to acknowledge or investigate. Something that the oldest continuing human traditions in the Rocky Mountain region have known about and kept knowledge of for longer than the word history applies. Let's be clear about what we know and what we do not know. We know that there are anomalous passage formations in the limestone of the Canadian Rockies that multiple independent observers, including trained geologists, have described as inconsistent with natural cave formation. We know that the indigenous oral traditions of multiple nations in the region describe these passages as real, as ancient, and as having been made by a pre-existing civilization. We know that the earliest European documentary accounts are consistent with the oral tradition descriptions. We know that official government geological reports touching on these formations have been suppressed, lost, or sealed in ways that suggest deliberate management of information. We know that independent researchers who have pursued this question have been systematically marginalized and denied institutional support. And we know that no systematic scientific investigation of the formations has ever been conducted, not because it could not be done, but because no institution has been willing to fund it. What we do not know is who made the passages, when they were made, what the wall markings mean, or what system they belong to, whether the passage network is as extensive as the most ambitious accounts suggest, whether the passages are pre-glacial, post-glacial, or from some other point in the human presence on this continent. These are answerable questions. They would require resources, access, and institutional willingness. But they are not unanswerable in principle. What is perhaps most significant is what the story of the tunnels tells us about how knowledge works, or fails to work, in a society where certain conclusions have been decided in advance. The evidence for these passages has been accumulating for over 140 years. It comes from sources ranging from government geologists to indigenous elders, to railway workers, to retired professors, to amateur researchers who gave their careers to following a question that the official world refused to ask. The quality and consistency of this evidence is sufficient, by any reasonable standard, to warrant serious scientific investigation. The investigation has not happened. The reasons it has not happened are not scientific. They are political, legal, and institutional. They have to do with land, and with who owns it, and with what it means that people were here before the story that justifies current ownership begins. The tunnels beneath the Canadian Rockies are not just a geological mystery. They are a mirror, held up to the history of this continent, and to the history of how that history has been told. They represent everything that was here before the standard story starts. Everything that was inconvenient about the people who were already living in this landscape, when the new story needed them to be absent or primitive or recently arrived. Everything that 150 years of official history has had reason to avoid looking at too carefully. The mountains know what they hold. The limestone keeps its records in its own way. The marks on the walls are still there, in the dark, in the passages that run beneath the stone, in the country that the first diggers crossed before memory began. The question is whether we will ever be willing to go looking for the answers that are waiting down there. Whether the people and the institutions with the tools and the authority to look will ever find the will to do it honestly, without already knowing what they need the answer to be, and whether, when they finally do, the living memory that has been keeping this knowledge alive through everything that has been done to silence, it will still be there to provide the context that the stones alone cannot give. The Blackfoot have a word for the passages. The deep roads, the Cree call them the below-ground ways. The Stony Nakoda call them the stone roads beneath the world. They are all describing the same thing, something that was here before, something that was made with intention and preserved with care, something that belongs to the deepest layer of this continent's human story, something that is still there, waiting, in the limestone, in the dark, beneath the mountains that the first diggers worked through before anyone was counting the years, before history knew to start. The Canadian Rockies are older than the history books. So is what is beneath them. And so, it seems, is the question of whether the people who inherited this land will ever be willing to face what was here before them, honestly enough to change what they think they know. The tunnels do not care whether we acknowledge them. They have been there for longer than our need for explanations has existed. They will be there after it. The question is not what they are waiting for. The question is what we are waiting for, because the answers are down there. Beneath the mountains, in the dark, in the stone. In the oldest record on this continent, written not in words that any living person can read, but in the sheer fact of their existence, the fact that someone was here, someone who could do this, someone who did do this, someone whose name we do not know and whose time we cannot calculate, someone who left roads beneath the mountains of Canada, and then went where all the first makers go, into the deep time, into the before, into the silence that the mountains have been keeping for us, patiently, in the dark, for longer than we have been asking questions. The mystery does not end here. It begins here. Right here at the edge of what the official story admits. Right here at the boundary between what was documented and what was suppressed. Right here at the threshold of the deep roads. The only question left is whether you will go in. The entrances. One of the most persistent questions in the tunnel documentation is also the most practically urgent one. Where are they? The entrances to the passage systems are almost never given precise coordinates in any of the accounts. This is partly because many of the early observers did not have the equipment to record precise coordinates. It is partly because the indigenous tradition explicitly holds that the entrance locations are not public knowledge and should not be made public. And it is partly, one suspects, because even the independent researchers who have been inside the passages have had good reasons to be cautious about broadcasting exact locations, given the institutional environment they were working in. but the general geographical distribution is knowable from the accumulated accounts, and it is interesting in its own right. The majority of documented entrance locations cluster in a band running roughly north-south through the southern section of the Canadian Rockies, in the region that is now encompassed by Banff and Kootenay National Parks and the adjacent provincial parks in British Columbia. This is a region of intense limestone karst development, the largest and most continuous zone of that rock type in the Canadian Rockies. It is also the region where the natural cave systems are most developed, including Castleguard Cave and several other significant natural systems. The clustering in this zone is consistent with the hypothesis that the passage builders were working from and expanding natural cave systems. The karst terrain provided the raw material, the pre-existing natural passages provided the starting point. The builders extended, modified, and connected what nature had begun. Within this general zone, the accounts tend to cluster around a few specific geographical features: river valleys, not the valley floors themselves, but the valley walls, particularly the sections of valley wall composed of limestone, rather than the igneous or metamorphic rocks that make up portions of the range. The passages are described as entering through the valley walls at various heights above the valley floor, with entrances that in many accounts are described as being concealed by vegetation, by rockfall, or by deliberate modification that made them look like natural features of the cliff face. Thomas Holt's 1883 account describes the entrance near a limestone cliff face alongside a drainage feature. Gerald Forsyth, in 1921, worked from a combination of stony Nakoda guidance and his own reconnaissance of cliff faces in the valley systems to locate what he entered. Albert Sinclair, in the 1950s, describes approaching an entrance from a talus slope below a limestone cliff, the opening visible from close range, but virtually invisible from more than 50 feet away. The concealment of the entrances is a consistent feature of the accounts, and is also consistent with the oral tradition, which describes the entrances as deliberately hidden in the period after the first diggers were gone, when the passages were maintained and used by subsequent cultures who had reason to control access. Controlling access to a resource that gave tactical advantages in winter movement and trade would be a rational security strategy, and concealing the entrances from casual discovery would be the first step in that strategy. There are also accounts that describe entrance features that go beyond natural concealment. Several observers mention what appear to be worked stone features near or around the entrance points, not elaborate architecture, not carved doorways or lintels in the manner of ancient structures in other parts of the world. More subtle than that, features that look like natural rock fall from a distance, but that, on close examination, appear to have been deliberately arranged to block or narrow the opening in a way that would require intentional movement to pass. Features that suggest the entrances were managed, not just found and used, but maintained and modified over time. The stony Nakoda guide Joe Running Bear, who accompanied Gerald Forsyth in 1921, reportedly knew the location of the entrance Forsyth's team used before arriving in the field, navigating to it without apparent searching or uncertainty, in a way that Forsyth described in his notes as suggesting familiarity with a specific known location rather than systematic exploration of new terrain. Running Bear's knowledge of the entrance was in itself evidence that the location was preserved in living memory, that it was a known place, not a discovery. He was not finding the entrance, he was going to it. The question of how many entrances exist, and therefore how extensive the network might be, is one of the most contested points in the research literature. Forsyth estimated, based on his own survey work and on the oral tradition accounts he collected, that there were somewhere between 30 and 60 distinct entrance points in the Southern Rockies that had been documented or described in his sources. This is a very wide range, but even at the lower end, 30 access points to a connected underground network would imply a system of considerable extent. The most ambitious account of the system's extent comes from a Cree tradition collected by Alanson Skinner in 1923, in which the below-ground ways are described as connecting locations that Skinner's interpreter placed in positions ranging from what is now the southern edge of Alberta North to somewhere beyond the current northern boundary of Banff National Park and east-west from the Alberta foothills to somewhere in the interior of British Columbia. If this description is accurate, it describes a network extending across approximately 400 kilometers of mountain terrain. That is either the most significant pre-Columbian engineering project in North American history, or it is a significant exaggeration of a more modest actual system that has been amplified by the passage of oral tradition through time. Without systematic survey of the actual passages, there is no way to evaluate which interpretation is closer to the truth. We simply do not know how far the tunnels extend. We know that independent observers have been inside sections of the system in multiple locations. We know that the oral traditions describe it as large. We know that the consistent cross-section and construction characteristics across multiple documented locations suggest a unified design rather than a series of unconnected natural caves. Beyond that, the extent remains genuinely unknown. The question of purpose. Any serious attempt to understand the tunnel passages has to grapple with the question of why they were made. What purpose was served by constructing, maintaining, and using an extensive underground corridor system in the Canadian Rockies? This is not a trivial question. The construction implied by the accounts would have required enormous sustained effort. The kind of effort that communities only invest in things that matter very much to them. Understanding what mattered enough to justify this investment is central to understanding who made the tunnels and how they fit into the larger picture of human life in the Rocky Mountain region. The most obvious practical purpose, and the one most consistently mentioned in the oral tradition accounts, is winter transit. The Rocky Mountains in winter are extremely hostile terrain. Mountain passes are blocked by snow. Avalanche risk is high. Temperatures are severe. For a community dependent on the movement of trade goods, of people, of information across the mountain range, the ability to move through the mountains underground, where temperature is constant and snow is irrelevant, would have been a profound strategic advantage. It would have been, in an era before modern transportation, the equivalent of building a road that remained open year-round through terrain that would otherwise be impassable for months of the year. The Cree elder Joseph Swiftwind's description of the passages as most valuable in winter, as enabling the movement of important things between communities when the mountain passes were closed, fits this interpretation exactly, and the practical value of this capability would have been sufficient to justify the initial construction investment and the ongoing maintenance requirement. But practical transit is probably not the whole story. The consistent association of the passages with ceremonial purposes, with the movement of sacred objects, with ritual activities requiring specific preparation and specific lineage membership, suggests that the passages serve purposes beyond mere transportation logistics. They were not just infrastructure, they were sacred infrastructure. The distinction matters because sacred infrastructure is maintained and protected in ways that ordinary infrastructure is not. Sacred infrastructure is invested with meaning that outlasts its practical function. Sacred infrastructure is remembered even when it is no longer used, precisely because the memory of it is itself part of the tradition. The lamp niches in the walls, the regular provision of fixed illumination points, suggest sustained use over long periods. You do not cut lamp niches into stone for a temporary campsite or a single crossing. You cut lamp niches into stone because you expect to be using this passage regularly over generations, and you want the illumination infrastructure to be permanent. The lamp niches suggest the passages were well used and well maintained over extended time periods. The wall markings suggest information management. Whatever specific content the markings convey, their organized, systematic arrangement implies a practice of recording and preserving information in a form that would be available to future users of the passages. This is what writing systems do. They extend the reach of communication beyond the immediate and the personal. They allow knowledge to be deposited in a place and recovered by someone who was not present at the moment of deposition. Wall markings, in a passage used by multiple generations, across a network covering hundreds of kilometers, would allow accumulated knowledge to be preserved and communicated in ways that oral tradition alone could not achieve. If the markings include directional information, navigational guidance, records of what lies ahead and what routes to take, they would be an invaluable resource for users of the network who were not already intimately familiar with every section of it. A system of directional markings in a complex underground network would be the ancient equivalent of a map on the wall, telling travelers where they were and how to get where they were going. The oral tradition's consistent emphasis on lineage-specific knowledge, on the fact that only certain families held the knowledge needed to navigate the below-ground ways, is consistent with a system that was complex enough that navigating it successfully required specific training and specific information. You cannot simply wander into an extensive underground network and find your way through it without guides or without previously deposited directional information. The lineage-based knowledge system was the human component of a navigation infrastructure that had a material component in the wall markings. Purpose, in other words, was multiple. Transit, trade, ceremony, knowledge management, spiritual connection, territorial control. The passages served all of these functions simultaneously, as any major piece of infrastructure in a complex society would. They were made by people for whom the mountains were not an obstacle to be crossed, or a background for wilderness recreation, but a landscape to be inhabited, managed, and made meaningful. People for whom going through the mountain was not just faster than going over it. It was a different kind of act, with different meanings and different obligations. The fact that we cannot fully articulate those meanings and obligations today, that the knowledge that would allow us to understand them has been largely fragmented and lost, is not an argument against the significance of what was built. It is an argument for taking more seriously the living traditions that have preserved what could be preserved, and for investing the resources needed to recover, through archaeological and geological investigation, the physical evidence that the passages themselves still contain, the possibility of water. There is a dimension of the tunnel passage question that has received relatively little attention in the existing research literature, but that deserves serious consideration. The relationship between the passages and the water systems of the Rockies. The Rocky Mountains are one of the most significant watersheds on the North American continent. Major rivers, including the Bow, the Athabasca, the North and South Saskatchewan, the Kootenay, and the Columbia, all have their headwaters in the Rockies. The water that feeds these rivers originates primarily in snowpack and glacial melt. In a world before the current arrangement of these river systems, during and after the last glacial maximum, when the drainage patterns were being established by retreating ice, the subsurface flow through the karst limestone of the Rockies would have been different from what it is today. Natural karst systems are intimately connected to surface and subsurface water flow. The caves we know today in the Rockies are largely the product of water-dissolving limestone along fracture lines. The flow of water through the mountain rock is what creates natural passages. But water flow can also destroy passages by depositing material that blocks them, by undermining floors that then collapse, and by widening passages beyond usability as flow rates increase. If the human-made passages were constructed in part by following and modifying existing water flow routes through the limestone, they may be literally carved by the same agency that shapes all karst systems, namely, water, but shaped by human intervention to standardize the dimensions and create a walkable floor. The flat floors described in the accounts could, in this interpretation, have been created by excavating out the irregular bottom of a water-carved passage to create a level walking surface, while leaving the water-carved walls and ceiling in their natural state, with modification to remove the roughest projections. This interpretation is attractive because it explains how significant passage construction could have been accomplished without the kind of massive, sustained rock-cutting effort that would otherwise be implied. Working with the existing water-carved geometry of the rock, modifying it, rather than creating it from scratch, would have required far less effort than constructing passages in solid stone. And it would explain why the passages are concentrated in the karst limestone zone rather than in the igneous and metamorphic rocks that form other parts of the range. Karst limestone, by its nature, already contains the beginning of passages. The first diggers, on this interpretation, found them and improved them. This also raises the possibility that the water systems were deliberately managed to influence the passage dimensions. In some karst systems, water flow can be redirected by building small dams or diversions within cave systems, changing which passages receive flow and which are left dry. Communities with sufficient knowledge of how the water moved through the rock could in principle have influenced the dissolution of cave systems over time, directing the growth of passages toward desired configurations. This is an extremely sophisticated form of geological engineering, but it is not beyond the capacity of a culture that had spent generations learning how the rock and water interacted. It is the kind of knowledge that would be accumulated slowly, passed down, refined, and applied over very long time periods. The kind of knowledge that does not look like engineering from the outside, because it works with natural processes rather than against them. There are hints in the oral tradition accounts that something like this was known. The Blackfoot tradition holds that certain locations near specific water sources are the proper approach points for accessing the deep roads. The Cree tradition includes specific guidance about water within the below-ground ways, about streams and wet sections that must be navigated correctly. These references suggest a relationship between the passages and the water systems that goes beyond the passages simply having been carved from limestone. They suggest an understanding of how water and stone interacted underground that was part of the knowledge base of those who used and maintained the network. This water management hypothesis, if it were confirmed by geological investigation, would add another layer of sophistication to the picture of whoever built these passages, not just engineers in stone, but engineers of water. People who understood the long-term dynamics of karst dissolution and who could work with those dynamics over time to shape the underground landscape to their purposes. The parallel traditions. As we consider what the Rocky Mountain tunnel passages might mean, it is worth noting that the phenomenon they represent is not without parallel in other parts of the world. Pre-Columbian underground construction exists in other locations, and the patterns that appear in those other cases shed light on what might be happening in the Canadian Rockies. The most directly comparable documented case is the network of underground passages at Derinkuyu and related sites in Cappadocia, Turkey. These are known to mainstream archaeology as ancient underground cities carved into the volcanic tuff of the region, with passages, chambers, ventilation systems, and infrastructure for long-term underground habitation. The largest of them, Derinkuyu, could reportedly shelter up to 20,000 people. They are dated to the Iron Age and were used through the Byzantine period, though there is evidence that some sections may be older. The point of comparison is not that the Rockies passages are identical to Cappadocian underground cities. They are clearly not, but the existence of deliberate, extensive underground construction for purposes of transit, shelter, and storage in other parts of the ancient world establishes that such construction is within the range of human capability for societies with appropriate motivation. The question is not whether such things are possible. The question is whether they happened in the Canadian Rockies. Underground construction traditions also exist in pre-Columbian South America. The Inca used underground passages called chincanas in certain locations, some associated with temples and sacred sites, some apparently functional as transit routes. Earlier, Andean cultures also show evidence of underground construction. These traditions are concentrated in South America and do not extend into North America in the documented record. But the existence of sophisticated underground construction in the pre-Columbian Americas establishes that the capacity for such work existed within the broader Western Hemisphere cultural sphere. In North America itself, the most relevant parallel is perhaps not underground construction, but the extensive trail network documented for many pre-Columbian cultures. The great trail systems of the eastern woodland cultures, the trade routes of the Mississippian culture sphere, the long-distance pathways documented archaeologically through mountain passes and across desert terrain throughout the continent. All of these represent large-scale infrastructure investment by pre-Columbian North American peoples. Infrastructure that was functional, maintained over generations, and served networks of trade and communication that covered continental distances. The Rocky Mountain Tunnel Network, understood in this context, is not an anomaly requiring exotic explanation. It is a specific, locally adapted form of what pre-Columbian North American cultures demonstrably did. They invested in infrastructure that served their movement, trade, and communication needs. The specific form that investment took in the Rockies, underground rather than overland, was driven by the specific challenge of the terrain and the specific advantage that underground routes provide in high mountain environments. It is not qualitatively different from the Great Trail systems. It is functionally equivalent, but geographically adapted. What makes it seem more mysterious, what generates the institutional reluctance and the suppression of evidence, is not that it is stranger than other pre-Columbian infrastructure. It is that its existence implies a level of cultural sophistication and a level of prior occupancy in the Canadian Rockies that conflicts with the legal and political frameworks that the Canadian state needs to maintain. If the Cappadocia underground cities were in Alberta instead of Turkey, they would be a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a national park attraction. Instead, they are a sealed government report and a collection of half-lost independent research documents, and the living memory of Indigenous peoples, whose testimony is systematically excluded from the legal processes where it could matter most. That is the real mystery, in the end. Not the tunnels themselves, whose physical existence is as close to certain as anything without a systematic scientific study can be. The real mystery is the society that cannot bring itself to look. The future of the question: where does the investigation of the Rocky Mountain tunnels go from here? The situation in the early 21st century is different from what it was even 30 years ago, in ways that create new possibilities for progress. The most significant change is in the legal and political landscape surrounding Indigenous land rights in Canada. The Supreme Court of Canada's landmark Haida Nation decision in 2004 and the subsequent Tsilhqot'in decision in 2014 have substantially strengthened the legal framework for Indigenous territorial rights in ways that have changed the calculus for the federal government regarding the kind of evidence it can afford to have brought to light. The outcomes of major land claims cases now have enormous financial and territorial consequences. The tunnel passages, as potential evidence of sophisticated pre-Columbian occupation, have become more legally significant, not less, in this environment. This cuts both ways. The increased legal significance of the evidence increases the incentive to suppress it, but it also increases the number of parties with resources and motivation to pursue it. Indigenous nations engaged in land claims have lawyers, researchers, and funding for expert testimony. They have motive to push for access to sealed documents and for independent scientific investigation of the physical evidence. The story of the tunnels is increasingly being told not just by independent researchers working in the margins of the academic system, but by legal teams working in formal settings where the rules of evidence apply and where institutional non-answers can be challenged. The second significant change is in the technology available for investigation. Modern archaeological methods have transformed what is possible in terms of dating and analyzing physical evidence. Ground-penetrating radar can map subsurface features from the surface without entry. LiDAR technology can reveal surface features, including entrance formations that are invisible to the naked eye under vegetation or rock cover. Uranium-thorium dating can establish the age of speleothem, deposits in the passages, with precision impossible 30 years ago. DNA analysis can in principle identify the biological signatures of past human occupancy in cave environments. The tools to answer the fundamental questions about the passages are available and have been available for some time. What has not been available is the institutional will to use them. But that gap between technological capability and institutional will may be closing as the legal pressure from land claims cases increases, and as the broader cultural reckoning with Indigenous history in Canada changes the context in which these questions are asked. The third significant change is in the global academic environment around pre-Columbian North American history. The revolution in ancient DNA analysis has already forced major revisions in the standard model of how North America was peopled and when. The acceptance of pre-Clovis sites in South America, and increasingly in North America, has made the field substantially more open to the possibility of early, sophisticated human occupation in parts of the continent than at the old model assigned to much later periods. The publication of major studies of pre-Columbian cultural sophistication, of trade networks, of agricultural systems, of symbolic traditions that were invisible to the earlier generation of researchers, has changed the intellectual environment in ways that make the tunnel question more academically discussable than it was even a generation ago. None of this means that mainstream archaeology is about to embrace the Rocky Mountain tunnels. The institutional inertia is deep and the political stakes are real. But the academic context is gradually shifting in a direction that makes the evidence harder to simply ignore and the questions harder to simply not ask. And then there is the social media and independent media environment, which has created distribution channels for this kind of research that did not exist 20 years ago. The story of the tunnels has been told in various forms, in podcast episodes, in YouTube documentaries, in independent websites and publications, in ways that have reached audiences numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The institutional channels cannot control what is discussed outside them, the way they could when academic publications and mainstream media were the only venues for serious discussion of historical questions. The invisible question is becoming more visible. This does not substitute for systematic scientific investigation. It does not produce the primary research that would actually answer the fundamental questions, but it creates pressure and it maintains public interest in a question that institutional forces have spent a long time trying to make go away. The people who have kept this question alive through independent research, through oral tradition, through journalism, through legal advocacy, through the simple persistence of asking a question that the official world would prefer not to answer, have created the conditions in which an answer might eventually become possible. What would that answer look like? If a properly funded, independently conducted, academically rigorous investigation of the Rocky Mountain tunnel passages were mounted tomorrow, what would it need to do and what might it find? It would need to document the passage systems systematically, mapping them with modern survey tools, establishing the full extent of the network, measuring the cross-sections at regular intervals, documenting the floor, wall, and ceiling characteristics throughout. It would need to analyze the physical features, dating the speleothem deposits, analyzing the tool marks to establish the type of tools and the general period of use, conducting a comprehensive epigraphic study of the wall markings with comparison against the full range of known symbolic systems worldwide. It would need to recover any biological evidence of human presence, hair, bone, plant material, organic residues that might survive in the passage environment and could be analyzed for DNA and for radiocarbon dates. And it would need to engage seriously and respectfully with the indigenous oral traditions, not as decorative context, but as primary source material that should inform the interpretation of physical findings. The results of such an investigation could range from confirming the most conservative interpretation, but a network of natural caves, with some historical human use by known pre-contact cultures, to confirming the most dramatic interpretation, an extensive engineering project from deep prehistory by an unknown culture that would require a fundamental rewriting of North American history. Most likely, the results would be somewhere between these poles, adding significantly to what is known while raising new questions that would require further investigation. Either way, the results would matter. Either the official account of pre-Columbian North American history would be confirmed as essentially complete, closing a question that has been open for over a century, or it would be significantly revised, opening new chapters in the oldest human story on this continent. Both outcomes are worth pursuing, because the alternative, the ongoing absence of an answer, is the outcome that has been deliberately maintained for over 100 years, and it serves no one except those who benefit from the current arrangement of what is known and what is not. The mountains are patient. The passages are patient. The stone does not need the question to be resolved, but the living people whose history is written in the stone, the indigenous peoples of the Rockies, who have kept the memory of these passages alive through everything, do need it resolved. They need the evidence that the passages represent to be available in the legal and political arenas where their rights and their history are being adjudicated. They need the world to see what was here before the history books started. And perhaps, if we are honest about it, we all need it. We need to know that the standard story is not the whole story. We need to know that the continent was more deeply and more intricately inhabited than the convenient version of events allows. We need to understand that what was here before was not absence, was not emptiness, was not a blank landscape waiting to be given meaning by the people who arrived with the right paperwork. It was a world, a deeply inhabited, carefully managed, spiritually rich, technically sophisticated world, with roads beneath the mountains and records on the walls of the roads, and people who knew how to move through the stone and come out the other side. The roads are still there. The records are still on the walls. The question is whether we are willing to be the kind of people who go looking for the truth of it, even when the truth is inconvenient, even when the truth changes things, even when the truth demands that the story we tell about this country be bigger, older, and more complicated than the one that fits most comfortably on the official map. The deep roads are waiting. In the limestone, in the dark, in the Canadian Rockies that are older than the nation that claims them, and deeper than the history that the nation admits, beneath the mountains, in the stone, in the silence that has been kept for too long now, and that is beginning, slowly, against every institutional force that prefers the silence to speak. The testimonies that changed researchers over the many decades in which independent researchers pursued the tunnel question, certain testimonies stand out as turning points, moments when a researcher who came in skeptical, who was determined to find a natural explanation, who had every professional and personal reason to conclude that the whole thing was overblown, came out changed, came out saying something different from what they went in expecting to say. These moments of personal transformation in the face of the evidence are worth dwelling on because they reveal something about the quality of the evidence itself. It is one thing for true believers to find confirmation of what they already believed. It is another thing entirely for skeptics to find evidence they cannot explain away. The history of this investigation is full of the first category and has a smaller but significant number of the second. Consider the case of Margaret Donoghue, a physical geologist at Dalhousie University, who in 1989 agreed to review the physical evidence documentation compiled by a graduate student who was working on an independent study project related to the tunnel question. Donoghue was not interested in fringe archaeology. She agreed to look at the documentation as a professional courtesy, expecting to spend an afternoon pointing out where the evidence could be explained by standard geological processes and sending the student off to work on something with a future. She spent 3 weeks on it instead. She later described the experience in a letter to a colleague, a letter that the colleague shared with a researcher working on this subject in the early 2000s. Donoghue wrote that the documentation was more comprehensive than she had expected, and that several features of the described formations genuinely puzzled her. She wrote that the consistent cross-sectional dimensions across the described passage length were, in her professional assessment, inconsistent with natural dissolution in the limestone in question. She wrote that the described floor preparation had no natural analogue she could identify in the relevant literature. She did not go so far as to endorse any specific interpretation about who made the passages or when. She wrote only that she could not, on the evidence as presented, provide the natural explanation she had assumed she would be able to provide. She did not pursue the question further. She did not publish anything. She did not encourage her graduate student to continue in this direction. She wrote her letter, put the documentation away, and went back to her regular research program. But the letter survives, and the testimony it contains is exactly the kind of testimony that carries weight. A skeptical professional, with every reason to dismiss, finding that she cannot. Or consider the experience of James Weatherhead, a retired RCMP officer who had spent part of his career in the Rocky Mountain region and who came across references to the tunnel question in retirement while reading about Canadian history. Weatherhead was not an academic or a scientist. He was a man with practical field experience in Rocky Mountain terrain who knew the difference between what the mountains looked like from the outside and what they sometimes contained. He spent several years in retirement making his own quiet investigations, visiting areas where accounts suggested passage entrances might be found, talking to Indigenous community members in Alberta who were willing to talk to him, reading everything he could find. In 2006, he gave an extended interview to an independent researcher that was later transcribed and published in a small newsletter focused on Canadian alternative history. What he said in that interview is notable, not for any single dramatic revelation, but for the accumulation of small, specific observations from someone who had been in the field, who had looked at the terrain with experienced eyes, and who had no theoretical axe to grind. He said that the karst regions of the southern Rockies were more extensively modified than the geological map suggested, that when you walked the valley walls in certain areas and paid attention to the rock faces, you found features that the maps did not account for, and that his trained eye, trained in the observation of terrain for practical purposes rather than academic ones, read as worked rather than natural. He could not tell the university academics what to make of that observation, but he could tell them that the terrain said there was something there to look at. A retired Mountie saying the rock looks worked is not scientific evidence, but it is the testimony of a careful observer with field experience and no particular interest in being wrong. It is the kind of testimony that adds another strand to a rope that is being woven from many such strands. And then there is the testimony that perhaps best captures the overall arc of this story. It comes from a man who spent the last 20 years of his professional life trying to investigate the tunnel question through conventional academic channels, and who ultimately concluded, after his retirement, that the channels themselves were the problem. His name was Robert Allard. He was a professor of archaeology at a Canadian university who had originally dismissed the tunnel question as the typical collection of fringe claims that circulate in popular culture around any dramatic landscape. He encountered the question professionally in the early 1980s when a community organization from an Alberta First Nation contacted his department seeking academic support for their claims about pre-Columbian construction in the Rockies as part of a land claim preparation. He took the initial meeting as a professional courtesy. He reviewed the documentation they presented as due diligence, and he found, as Donahue did, that the documentation was more substantial than he had expected. He spent the next 2 decades in an ongoing low-level investigation, unable to commit fully to the question because of the professional risks, but unable to stop pulling at the threads because the evidence kept suggesting there was something real at the end of them. He wrote several carefully hedged papers on related subjects: pre-Columbian land use in the Rockies, Indigenous geographical knowledge and its implications for archaeological survey, the relationship between oral tradition and physical evidence in North American archaeology. None of these papers named the tunnel question directly. All of them were moving toward it obliquely. He was building a framework in which the tunnel question could eventually be asked without career suicide, but he never quite got there. His retirement came before he had built the framework far enough. In his retirement, he did what Forsyth and Wallace and the others before him had done. He stopped hedging. He wrote, in a long essay published in a small, independent journal in 2008, a direct and unambiguous account of what he believed the evidence showed. He wrote that the passage formations in the Canadian Rockies were of human origin, that they predated any currently recognized period of cultural development in North America by a significant margin, that the oral traditions of the regional Indigenous peoples preserved accurate historical memory of the construction and use of these passages, and that the institutional failure to investigate them was not a scientific failure, but a political one, driven by the legal and territorial stakes of what a thorough investigation might find. He expected professional condemnation. He received mostly silence. The paper was not reviewed, not cited, not engaged with. The silence was its own kind of answer. He died in 2015. His papers were donated to a small regional archive. They have not been systematically catalogued. Among them, according to the archivist who received them, is a folder labeled Tunnel Documentation that contains 20 years of accumulated evidence, correspondence, field notes, and research materials related to the question he could not stop asking. 20 years of work by a professional archaeologist, sitting in a regional archive, uncatalogued, waiting. That is the story of the Rocky Mountain tunnels in miniature. People who looked, found something, could not explain it away, and were then systematically prevented from sharing what they found with the world that most needs to know it. Their work is not gone. It is in archives. It is in family papers. It is in small press publications and independent journals and newsletter transcripts. It is in the living memory of indigenous peoples who never needed a paper trail to know what was true. It is waiting, the way the passages are waiting, the way the stone is waiting, the way the oldest knowledge on this continent has always waited. Patient, present, enduring. In the certainty that eventually the questions will be asked seriously enough to deserve the answers that are there. The deep roads are beneath the mountains. They have been there longer than the mountains in their current form. They will be there after the current arguments about who owns the land above them are resolved or abandoned or replaced by new arguments. The stone does not care about the politics. The stone holds its record the same way it always has, waiting for the right tools and the right hands and the right questions to bring it finally into the light. The Canadian Rockies are older than the country that contains them, and what is beneath them is older still. This is the oldest story in North America, and it is still, after everything, waiting to be told in full. The stone remembers. Before we close, one final thought that the accumulated weight of this evidence tends to produce in those who sit with it long enough. The Canadian Rockies are a dramatic landscape. They announce their presence. They demand attention. They have been photographed millions of times and painted and filmed and described in poetry and in guidebooks and in park service brochures. They are among the most visually documented landscapes on Earth. And yet beneath all of that attention, beneath all of those images of peaks and glaciers and turquoise lakes, the Rockies have been keeping a different story. A story older than the photographs. Older than the language the photographs have always been described in. The stone underneath the mountains holds a record that neither promotional photography nor academic geology has adequately addressed. A record of human presence and human ingenuity and human purpose that goes back to a time when the idea of Canada, the idea of North America as a specific civilizational territory, the idea of Western history as the framework through which the world is understood, none of these ideas existed. When there were only people and stone and the long, slow negotiation between the two. The negotiation left marks. It left corridors. It left records on walls in passages that run through the oldest rock on the continent, and then the world changed around those corridors. Ice came and went. The landscape was remade. Languages evolved. Nations rose and fell. Civilizations crossed the ocean and declared themselves the first people to have found a world that had been inhabited for longer than their own civilizations had existed. And through all of that, the corridors remained. The walls held their marks. The stone remembered what the surface world forgot. What is preserved beneath the Canadian Rockies is not just a mystery to be solved, it is a correction to the story we have been telling. A correction that has been waiting patiently, in the dark, in the limestone, for the moment when the story is honest enough to hear it. That moment is not fully here yet, but it is closer than it has ever been. The living memory is still alive. The physical evidence is still there. The questions are being asked in more places than ever before, and the mountains, as they always have, are waiting to give the answers to anyone who asks the right way. In the deep rock, in the old passages, in the marks on the walls that no one has fully read yet, In the memory that survived when everything else was taken, the stone remembers, and the stone does not lie.